Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I work the late-night shift at a small, barely used bus station on the edge of town. There's never much traffic at this hour, and the place feels empty even when it's full. The fluorescent lights flicker and buzz, the floors are always sticky, and the air smells stale. But tonight felt different. It was close to 2 a.m. when I noticed him. He sat alone on one of the benches, eyes fixed on the cracked window as if waiting for something, or someone. His clothes were old-fashioned, not quite vintage, but something about them felt out of place. A dark trench coat, a fedora, pulled low over his face, and a pair of shoes that gleamed too brightly for the grime around us. I tried to ignore him. This late at night, passengers were few, and I didn't want to be rude by staring. But there was something unsettling about the man. His stillness, his silence. He hadn't moved since I first saw him. I was behind the counter, half reading a book to pass the time, when the man's gaze suddenly shifted towards me. His eyes, sharp, pale, like ice, pierced through the darkness. He didn't smile or speak, just stared. My stomach dropped, and I quickly turned back to my book, pretending not to notice. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled as a woman entered. She had the same air of urgency that you often see in people who just missed their bus. Her eyes were wide, frantic, as if she were looking for someone. She scanned the room, her gaze resting briefly on me before her eyes locked onto the man in the trench coat. She froze. I watched the interaction, confused. The woman took a few hesitant steps toward him, as if drawn by an invisible force. I stood, ready to ask if she needed help, when she spoke. "I didn't think it was you," she whispered. Her voice trembled as though terrified of being heard. The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. His gaze never left her face, and for a moment I thought time had stopped. The woman turned quickly and walked to the exit. "It's too late," she muttered under her breath. "Too late. I'm sorry." I stood still, a knot forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The woman's voice was filled with dread, but the man hadn't moved an inch. Not once. I turned to the clock on the wall, 2:05 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room had become colder, darker. The usual hum of the station was muffled, as though the air itself had thickened. Just as I was about to approach the man to ask if he needed help, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. But I didn't hear them right. Away. They seemed to be getting louder only once I realized that the room was silent. Too silent. My heart raced. I turned around. No one. The station was empty. Then the bell jingled again. I whipped around to find the man gone, but not the way he had come. No footsteps, no sound at all. Just gone. The door had opened, but it hadn't creaked or swayed. It simply opened. Then, from the far corner of the station, I saw it. A figure stood there, just inside the shadows. The same man, his back turned toward me. He was holding something in his hand, something that shimmered in the dim light, like glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't look away. I felt myself move, step by step, as if I had no control. The hairs on my neck stood on end. My breath quickened. Suddenly, the figure turned around, and I saw his face for the first time. His eyes were wide open and his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the reflection in his eyes, of me, of my face. The reflection wasn't mine, though. It was twisted, pale, decayed. I froze in place, unable to move, unable to speak. My own reflection in the man's eyes seemed to mock me. It grinned, a horrifying, toothless smile. I couldn't breathe. The station felt suffocating. The air itself was wrong. Then, as quickly as it happened, The man and the reflection disappeared. The lights flickered, and I was left standing alone in the same empty station I had been before. The silence was deafening. I glanced at the clock. 2:07 a.m. I looked around. No one. The doors were locked. Everything seemed as it should be. I glanced at the bench where the man had sat earlier, and my stomach sank. His hat was there, still, sitting, as if waiting for him. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in this place a second longer. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, faint and far away, whisper from the shadows. "You should have taken the last bus. I didn't look back." I had just moved into the apartment on the top floor of an old building, a place so quiet that I often wondered if anyone else even lived there. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked under the slightest movement. The landlord was a gruff man, hardly speaking more than necessary, and I quickly learned not to ask questions. My first night was uneventful, aside from the odd silence. It was almost too quiet, like the city itself had forgotten to exist outside my windows. Around midnight, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something. A soft, scratching sound, followed by a faint thud. It seemed to come from the hallway. I figured it was just the building settling, but it persisted, growing louder and more frantic. I hesitated, then got out of bed and opened my door. The hallway was dark, the single overhead light flickering like it was struggling to stay on. I stepped out, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. At the end of the hall, I saw something odd, an open door to the neighboring apartment. I'd never seen that door open before. It had been locked when I moved in, and no one else seemed to live there. The apartment's vacancy had been part of the reason I rented the place. My curiosity got the better of me. I walked over cautiously, every creak of the floorboards seeming unnaturally loud. As I approached the door, the scratching noise intensified. My heart thudded in my chest. I peered inside. The apartment was dark, but I could just make out something in the middle of the living room. A tall, gaunt figure stood perfectly still, its back turned to me. I froze. A sudden wave of nausea washed over me. The figure didn't move. There was no sound except for my own breathing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were stuck, unwilling to move. Then the figure turned slowly, its face hidden in the shadows. It was almost as though the darkness itself swallowed its features. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed magnified. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling the window. At some point, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming from the hallway again. I didn't dare open the door this time. Instead, I pressed, my back to the wall, listening. The steps stopped outside my door. A long, unnerving silence followed. Then the knob turned. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting, but it didn't open. The silence stretched on until, finally, the footsteps retreated. My pulse slowly returned to normal, but I knew something was wrong. The next day, I told the landlord about the door, about the strange figure, and about the steps outside my apartment. He listened, but his face didn't change. He simply nodded, and told me that the neighbor had moved out recently. No one had rented the apartment since. That night, the scratching returned. This time, I had no intention of investigating. I sat in my room, trying to drown out the noise with music, but the scratching persisted. It wasn't coming from the apartment anymore. It was coming from inside my own walls. I covered my ears, but I could still hear it. A frantic, desperate, scratching. Then, something even worse happened. The scratching turned into a tapping sound, as though something was knocking from within the wall. calling to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord again. "Something's wrong with the walls, please, you need to check it." His voice was calm, too calm. "It's just the pipes, don't worry about it." I didn't believe him. As I stood in my apartment, the noise grew louder, more intense, the walls vibrating under the pressure. It felt like something was trying to break through, to get to me. But the knocking didn't last long. It stopped suddenly, as if whatever it was had found a way out. I waited, half expecting the door to open again, half expecting the dark figure to step inside. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no knocking. Just silence. The next morning, I woke up to an odd sound, the rustling of paper under the door. I opened it and found a yellowed envelope, addressed to me in dark, jagged handwriting. I opened it slowly, heart pounding, my hands trembling. The note inside was short, the writing twisted. "You are not alone. He is watching. He is waiting." The chill in my spine grew as I looked down the hallway, half expecting to see the figure, standing at the end of it, just watching me. But there was nothing. I moved out that very day, leaving the note behind. I never saw the landlord again. No one ever mentioned the apartment after that. And when I passed the building months later, it was strangely quiet, almost as if it had been abandoned. People said the house was cursed. They said it wasn't really empty. When I got the call from my cousin Greg, asking me to help clean it out, I hesitated. He was moving back into town and needed to clear out the mansion before selling it. The place had always given me a bad feeling, but family is family, so I agreed. I met Greg at the house just as the sun began to set. The mansion seemed even more imposing in the dying light, its shadow stretching across the lawn. Greg was standing outside, looking up at it with a mix of nostalgia and discomfort. "Ready to get this over with?" he asked, forcing a smile. "Yeah, let's just get inside." The door creaked open as soon as Greg touched the handle, the rusted hinges groaning like they hadn't been used in decades. Inside, the air was musty, thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. The smell of old wood and mildew filled the air. As we made our way deeper into the house, I noticed strange things. Paintings on the walls that didn't seem to belong, their eyes unsettlingly lifelike. Antique furniture covered in white sheets stood in the corners like forgotten memories. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. We started in the living room, moving the furniture out of the way. That's when we found the door, hidden behind a faded rug. It was small and inconspicuous, barely noticeable, but it caught my eye, and I couldn't resist. "What's this?" I asked, pulling the rug away to reveal a wooden trap door. Greg frowned. "Probably just an old cellar. Let's leave it." But something about it called to me. Without waiting for his approval, I grabbed the handle and yanked it open. A musty smell hit me hard, like earth and decay. A narrow staircase spiraled down, into the darkness below. "You sure about this?" Greg asked, his voice wavering. I didn't answer. The air down there felt different, thick and oppressive, like something was watching us. I took the first step, then another, Greg reluctantly following. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the walls damp and covered in mold. But it wasn't the temperature that chilled me. It was the feeling of being not alone. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the room stood an old wooden chest. It was covered in dust, but there was something unsettling about it, like it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for us. "What is this?" I whispered, taking a step closer. Greg hesitated, then followed me. He didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't resist. I opened the chest. Inside was a tattered old book, its pages yellow and brittle. The cover was covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them, As I touched the book, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. My breath came out in a visible cloud. The room seemed to tremble, and then the whispering began. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling the leaves outside. But then it grew louder, clearer, as if someone was speaking just behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Greg stepped back, his eyes wide. "What's happening?" I could barely hear him over the whispers, the words now growing frantic, chaotic. The ground beneath us trembled, and the walls seemed to shift, like the house itself was alive, pulling us in. Before I could answer, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. But then, a low, rumbling growl echoed from deep within the walls. The air vibrated, and the chest slammed. "Shut by itself! Get out! Now!" Greg shouted, panic rising in his voice. I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted back up the stairs, the mansion groaning as if it was waking from a long slumber. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. We pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in the hallway. It moved quickly, too quickly, like it was more than human. The figure stepped into the light, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes, those eyes, were glowing red. A sickening laugh echoed through the halls. "Trying to escape," the figure rasped. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. Who are you?" The figure stepped closer, its form shifting, blurring. "I've been waiting for someone to open the chest. Now, you're mine." The walls seemed to close in, the house shifting and groaning as if it were alive. I could feel the floor vibrating under my feet, the very foundation of the house shaking. With one last, desperate effort, I pushed the door. This time, it gave. I burst into the yard, the cold night air hitting my face as I ran, not looking back. Greg was ahead of me, and we didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. Behind us, the mansion loomed, silent now, but I could feel it, watching. We never spoke about what happened in that house. I moved into the old house on Hillcrest Drive because it was cheap, and I needed somewhere to stay after a breakup. The house was large, creaky, and covered in ivy, like something out of a Gothic novel, but I figured I could make it work. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, cleaned a bit, and settled into the dimly lit living room. But something about the house felt wrong. Not haunted, not exactly, but off. It was quiet. Too quiet. I shrugged it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. The next day, I discovered the mirror. It was in the hallway, at the far end of the house, an antique frame, tarnished silver, with intricate designs carved into the wood. At first, I didn't think much of it, but later, as I walked past, I stopped, feeling the oddest compulsion to look into it. I saw myself, of course, me, standing alone in the dim light. But then, something happened. My reflection changed. For a split second, my reflection blinked, at a different time than I did. My own face seemed to watch me with an unsettling intensity, almost as if it was waiting for me to move. I stepped back, heart pounding, and quickly turned away. That was ridiculous, I thought. Just a trick of the light, but every time I walked past that mirror after that, it happened. My reflection would lag just slightly behind me. Sometimes it would move even when I didn't. One evening, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the mirror determined to prove it was just my imagination. I stared hard at my reflection, willing it to move exactly when I did. But then I saw something I couldn't ignore. My reflection wasn't mimicking me at all. It was watching me, as if it had its own will. My heart skipped a beat. I reached out, trembling, to touch the surface of the glass. It was cold. Then my reflection smiled, but I didn't. I stepped back quickly, breath ragged as a chill crawled down my spine. There was no mistaking it now. Something was wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see my reflection in that mirror, grinning back at me. And every time I looked away, it seemed to wait for me, as if it had its own thoughts and desires. The next day, I went to the local antique shop, hoping to find answers. The shopkeeper was an old woman with sharp eyes. When I told her about the mirror, she didn't look surprised. She simply stared at me for a moment before speaking. "That house, it's cursed," she said softly, her voice like dry leaves. "The mirror is just a symptom. Something terrible was trapped inside it long ago, and now it's trying to get out." I felt my blood run cold. I didn't want to hear more, but I had to know. "It waits for the right person," she continued. "It chooses someone who will be susceptible to its whispers, to its control. And once it has you, you'll never escape." I didn't sleep at all that night. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I passed the mirror, my reflection seemed to get closer. Sometimes I would see it blink or move its lips, mouthing words I couldn't understand. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The next evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to destroy the mirror. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and went to the hallway. My reflection, as always, stood there, silent, waiting. I lifted the hammer, my hand trembling, and swung it at the glass. But just before it hit, something shifted. The reflection in the mirror grinned wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally, and in a voice that wasn't mine, it whispered, "You should have stayed away." I froze, staring at the mirror. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was real. It was coming from the reflection, which was now moving on its own, as if it wasn't even connected to me anymore. The figure inside the glass raised its hand, reaching for me. I dropped the hammer, backing away in terror. The reflection's hand pressed against the glass from the inside, and then it began to push through. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding like a drum. But as I glanced back at the house, I saw something in the window. A figure. It was me. No, it wasn't me. The reflection was standing there, staring at me, grinning that same wide grin. But I could see the difference now. It wasn't my reflection anymore. It was something else, something that had taken its place. I left that night, never looking back. The house was sold to someone else soon after, but I heard rumors of strange things happening there. People would pass by and see a figure in the window, just standing, watching. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a crowd, I feel it again. The sensation of someone watching me, just behind my shoulder. When I turn, I never see anyone, but I know they're there, waiting, just like my reflection. I had always been curious about old houses. So when I moved into a house built in the early 1900s, I was excited to explore every inch of it. The real estate agent had told me the house was charming, though he was quick to mention that it had been vacant for years. I wasn't bothered by that. It just made the place feel more like mine. The first week was uneventful. The house creaked and groaned with age, but I found it comforting. That was until I decided to explore the attic. The stairs leading up to the attic were narrow, and the door was hidden behind an old wardrobe in the hallway. Dust filled the air as I opened it, and the smell of something stale lingered. But then, in the far corner, something caught my eye. A full-length mirror standing against the wall. It was tarnished, the silver frame intricately carved with designs that seemed too ornate for such an old house. I felt a strange pull toward it, a tugging sensation that I couldn't explain. I stepped closer, and the air in the attic seemed to get colder, heavier. My reflection in the mirror was distorted, as though something about it didn't quite match. I leaned in to take a better look, but then I saw someone behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. and I glanced back at the mirror. The figure was still there. It was a woman dressed in a long, flowing white gown. Her face was pale, but there was something unnerving about it. Her eyes, they were fixed on me, wide open, unblinking. I took a step back, but the reflection didn't move. It waited, staring at me. Suddenly, I felt a sharp coldness brush against my skin. A gust of wind seemed to come from nowhere, and I quickly turned to leave the attic, but as I reached for the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The mirror, reflecting my panic, seemed to shift, ever so slightly, like the woman was now closer. In a flash, I turned the handle again. It was locked. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away from the mirror. Her reflection was no longer motionless. She was moving, slowly, step by step, as if approaching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I pounded on the door. "Hello? Someone help me!" Nothing, no answer. The house was silent except for the sound of my breath, ragged and frantic. The woman's reflection in the mirror began to smile. Slowly, unnervingly. Her lips curled into a grin that stretched too wide, her eyes never leaving mine. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. Then, without warning, the door swung open. I stumbled out of the attic, not stopping to look back. I ran down the stairs, through the living room, and out of the house. I didn't go back for days. When I finally worked up the courage to return, I brought a friend. Together, we went up to the attic. But the mirror was gone. It wasn't even in the house anymore. We looked everywhere, but it was as if it had never been there at all. The attic was bare, the air still and thick with dust. We found the wardrobe where the door had been, but nothing else. I left that house soon after, but there's one thing I can't forget. On the day I moved out, I passed a small antique shop on the edge of town. Behind the glass, there was a familiar, tarnished mirror. I could still see her eyes, staring back at me. I wasn't supposed to stay at the old house. It was supposed to be a quick visit, just a place to crash while I checked on a job in the area. My friend Melissa had rented the house for a few weeks, but she'd gone away on a trip and asked me to look after it. The house was isolated, sitting at the edge of a small, quiet town. It looked harmless enough. Rustic, old, but well-maintained. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the age of the place, the kind of drafty atmosphere you expect in old homes. That night, I tried to relax in the living room, the fireplace crackling with warmth. But something felt off. The silence was too deep, too thick. I kept hearing little noises from the walls, scratching sounds almost like nails tapping. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the longer I sat there, the more unsettling it became. I went to bed around midnight, pulling the covers up to my chin. The house creaked as it cooled, the wind howling outside. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, just a breath, like someone was standing just beyond my door. "Help me." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I thought I must have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Please, help me." I shot up in bed, my breath shallow. The room was dark save for the soft light from the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains. I was alone. I couldn't have imagined it. The voice, that soft, pleading voice, had come from the walls. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone, trying to find any explanation, any reason this might be happening. But as I scrolled through, "My messages," the voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Please, help me." I couldn't ignore it anymore. The voice was coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards from deep inside the house. I went to the living room, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It only grew more urgent, a soft murmur that twisted into a demand. "Let me out." My head spun. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled to the floor and crawled toward the center of the room. The floorboards creaked as I pressed my ear against the cold wood, my pulse racing. The voice, pleading, begging, was clearer. Now. It sounded closer, like it was beneath my feet. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just silence. Then the sound of a slow, deliberate tapping from below. I backed away, my hands trembling. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't right. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to investigate, but something compelled me. I crept up the stairs, every step, creaking beneath my weight. The air grew colder as I moved, the house seeming to close in around me. The whispering grew louder, as though it followed me. In the hallway, I noticed something that wasn't there before. A small door, almost hidden, in the wall, like a forgotten closet. The door was cracked open, but I could see no light inside. Only darkness. The voice came again, now frantic from behind that door. "Help me, please." Without thinking, I grabbed the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, sending a chill up my spine. I pulled the door open and found myself staring into a narrow, pitch-black space. My heart skipped. There was no way anyone or anything could fit in there. But then I heard it. A faint, wet sound, like breathing. I didn't know what made me do it, but I reached into the darkness, my hand shaking as I felt along the cold wall. My fingers brushed against something soft, something moist, and I screamed. The air around me shifted. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything went completely still. The house was silent again. But as I pulled my hand back, I felt something. Something sticky and cold. I turned and looked, and there, in the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall, too tall. Its face was hollow, empty, but its eyes, they glowed with a sickly yellow light. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. It whispered again, but this time the voice came from its lips. "I told you to help me." Then it lunged forward, and in a blur of darkness and cold I felt a sharp, icy grip on my arm. I screamed, but no sound escaped. My vision blurred as the cold seeped deeper into my skin. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's hollow eyes, locked on mine. When I woke, I was back in the living room, lying on the floor, the sun rising outside. My body was stiff, my arm aching. I couldn't explain it. The house was silent again, no voices, no tapping, just the stillness of an empty home. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut, the locks refusing to turn. As the day passed, the whispering began again. I heard it coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. "Help me. Help me." The voice wasn't in the walls anymore. It was in my head. I had never meant to be there. It was supposed to be a quick stop at the gas station, then back on the road. But when I saw the faded sign for the Dead Hollow amusement park just off the highway, curiosity got the best of me. It looked abandoned, rusting, rides creaking in the wind, dark windows on the roller coaster cars. But there was something about it that felt alive. I pulled into the parking lot. The engine's hum the only sound in the empty air. The gates were unlocked, swinging slightly in the breeze, inviting me in. The old ticket booth was empty, and the entrance was open. Something about the way the wind whispered through the cracked concrete made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside. The park was eerily quiet. No music, no sounds of people, just the occasional gust of wind that made the swings creak. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I walked deeper into the park, I noticed a carnival ride in the distance, the Ferris wheel. It was rusted, but it still stood tall, casting a long shadow across the grounds. I figured I'd take a look. As I neared the Ferris wheel, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The seats swayed, gently rocking as though they'd just been used. I checked my watch. It was late, way past closing time for any amusement park. I reached for the railing, my fingers brushing against something warm. I pulled my hand back quickly. A low, soft laugh echoed from behind me. I froze. The laugh wasn't loud, just a whisper, almost like it was in my head. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing. The wind picked up again and I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, but then I saw it. A figure standing by the ticket booth. It was tall, with long, shadowy limbs. Its face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel its gaze, like it was watching me, studying me. I called out, "Hello?" No response. My feet felt heavy as I took a step forward, but the figure didn't move. It was almost as if it was waiting for something. I took another step, then another, and then the ground beneath me trembled. The Ferris wheel groaned and started to move, slowly at first, but with increasing speed. The seats swayed wildly, the chains creaking as if they hadn't been used in years. The figure turned its head, slowly and deliberately, to face me, and then it spoke, its voice low, gravelly, like a whisper carried by the wind. "Do you want to ride?" I felt my blood run cold. I shook my head, my mouth dry. "No, I just need to go." But as I turned to leave, the Ferris wheel's motion quickened. It was spinning now, faster and faster, like it was alive. I ran toward the gate, but the path back was blocked by something. I turned, my heart pounding. The figure was standing right in front of me, its face now visible. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and stretched too tight over hollow cheeks. Its eyes were wide and glassy, black as coal. It was smiling at me. "You're already on the ride," it whispered. Before I could react, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling into darkness. I woke up in the Ferris wheel seat, high above the ground. The wind howled around me, but all I could hear was the eerie laughter growing louder, as if it was coming from everywhere. The ride had stopped moving. The lights were dimming, and then, as I looked down, the park was gone, replaced by a vast, dark void. The figure was still there, standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, its eyes fixed on me. The Ferris wheel began to move again, spinning wildly, faster and faster. But this time, it didn't stop. I screamed. It had been a long day. I was driving home late at night after an exhausting business trip. The roads were empty, the only sound the hum of my car's engine. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the rural highway. As I passed through the outskirts of town, I noticed something strange, a figure standing on the side of the road alone in the darkness. I slowed down, unsure of whether to stop. The figure didn't move, just stood there, shrouded in shadow. It looked like a person, but something about it felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't a fan of stopping on deserted roads at night, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over. The figure didn't acknowledge my car, didn't even glance in my direction. It simply stood, still as stone. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey, are you all right?" The figure turned slowly. I froze. It wasn't a person. The face, if you could call it that, was pale and smooth. No features, just an empty void where the eyes should be. The mouth, a thin, jagged line, twisted unnaturally wide as it began to smile. I didn't wait for anything else. I slammed the car into drive and sped off without a second thought, my heart racing. The figure never moved, but I could feel it, watching me, its gaze burning into my back. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure standing right behind my car in the reflection. But when I turned around to look, there was nothing, just the endless stretch of empty road behind me. I kept driving, my eyes flickering between the road ahead and the mirror, my hands tight on the wheel. Every mile felt longer than the last. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something else. A shadow crossing the road in front of me. It was too quick, too fluid. I swerved instinctively, but there was nothing to hit. I glanced to the side of the road again, heart in my throat, and saw it. The figure from before, now standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. This time, I didn't stop. I floored the accelerator, my car surging forward, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back. The miles stretched on, and the eerie feeling never left. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. I finally reached the turnoff for my street, relieved to be close to home. But as I made the turn, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. The figure. It was standing on the side of the road just where I'd turned. I couldn't believe it. How was it possible? I sped up, barely keeping the car steady as I turned, into my driveway. The headlights flickered as I pulled to a stop, the driveway silent except for the idling engine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but when I looked up, my blood ran cold. Standing at the foot of my front door was the figure. It wasn't walking. It was just standing there, waiting. I ran inside, locked every door, and bolted the windows. My phone was shaking in my hands as I dialed the police. As I waited for the call to connect, I kept staring out the window, watching the figure. Its smile was still there, wide and unnatural. But then, just as I was about to speak, to the operator, the smile twisted further, more grotesque, as though it was stretching in response to my fear. And then I realized the horrible truth. The figure was not waiting for me to call the police. It was waiting for me to open the door. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, watching it. My mind kept screaming at me to lock all the doors, to stay away from the windows. But the figure never moved, not even when I finally heard the faint sound of footsteps outside, steps coming closer to my door. I finally managed to pull myself together and grabbed the phone, dialing 911 in a panic. But as the phone rang, the footsteps stopped. The line on the other end connected, but I didn't hear anyone. Instead, the sound of static buzzed through the phone, and then I heard it, a voice, soft, breathy, and disturbingly familiar. Let me in. I turned, my heart stopping, but when I looked toward the door, the figure was gone. The footsteps stopped. The phone line went silent. I stayed awake all night, checking every window, every lock. By morning, the sun had risen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no traces, nothing out of place. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned something chilling. The figure I'd seen standing by the road had been seen before. People had reported seeing it at night, standing along deserted highways, its wide, twisted smile burning into their memory. They said that once you saw it, it never stopped watching. I haven't left my house after dark since. And every now and then, when I pass a window, I swear I see a shadow standing just outside, waiting. I thought I knew every creak, every groan of my apartment building. It was old, but it had always felt like home. That is, until I moved into apartment 3B. It started a few weeks ago when I noticed strange things, faint tapping sounds in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but the tapping became rhythmic, like someone was knocking, but not on the door. It was coming from the walls, always late, always when I was trying to sleep. One night, after tossing and turning for hours, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the dark hallway outside my door. The building was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of neighbors' footsteps or distant voices absent. As I walked, I noticed that the tapping was louder now, closer. It wasn't just one wall. It was everywhere, as if something was moving through the walls themselves. I reached the end of the hallway and paused by the entrance to the stairwell. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hall, motionless. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a dark, flowing coat. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze, like it was staring straight at me. Frozen, I could barely breathe. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet were stuck, as if some invisible force was holding me in place. Then, without a sound, the figure slowly began to move toward me. Every step it took seemed to echo, but it never made a sound. The tapping grew louder, and I realized it was coming from inside the walls, surrounding me. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in. Just as the figure was a few feet away, I snapped out of my trance and bolted toward my apartment door. I didn't look back. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed my back against the door, panting, convinced that I had escaped whatever that thing was. But the tapping didn't stop. It had followed me. I crawled into bed, trying to shut my mind off, trying to forget what I had seen. But the tapping, the relentless tapping, continued, louder now, coming from directly beneath my bed. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight again and knelt beside the bed, shining it underneath. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, and just as I started to stand, I felt it. Something brushing against the back of my neck. Cold. So cold. I froze, unable to turn around. The tapping was no longer coming from beneath the bed. It was coming from inside the room, right next to me, close enough that I could feel it with every breath I took. Then, the voice came. "You didn't think I'd leave, did you?" I whipped around, but no one was there. My skin crawled, my hands shaking. I rushed to the door again, desperate to get out, but the knob wouldn't turn. Panic surged through me. My only escape was the window, but it was too high. That's when I noticed the reflection in the glass, the figure from the hallway. It was outside, staring through the window, its face now visible. Pale, hollow eyes. A twisted smile that stretched too far across its face. It was motionless at first, but then, slowly, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. The tapping stopped. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence getting closer, closing in on me. I backed away from the window, heart hammering, when suddenly the lights flickered and everything went pitch black. The tapping returned, louder than ever, now from every direction. It was in the walls, under the floorboards, in the ceiling, a cacophony of sharp, hollow noises that made my skin crawl. "Why won't you let me in?" The voice was no longer a whisper. It was inside my head. "You knew I was here," I screamed. I grabbed the phone to call for help, but the screen was blank. No signal. And then I heard the voice again. This time, it was right behind me. "You're not alone anymore." I spun around to face the figure, but this time it was different. Its face was right in front of mine, the pale skin stretched tight over bone, the eyes empty, black voids. I could feel its breath on my face, cold as ice. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my body frozen. Then, everything stopped. The tapping, the voice, the figure, everything. And I realized, standing there in the dark, that I had no idea how long it had been since I had first moved into 3B. I couldn't remember when I had last left the apartment. I couldn't remember how I had ended up here. I took a step back, but the door was gone. There was no escape. The figure was still there, watching me, and I finally understood. It had always been watching, always waiting. It started when I moved into the apartment. The place was small but perfect for me, clean, cheap, and close to work. The only thing I didn't like was the bathroom mirror. It was old, slightly warped, and bolted to the wall. No matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't come off. The first time I noticed something strange, I was brushing my teeth late at night. I turned away for a second, and when I looked back, my reflection was slower to follow. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second. Lag, but enough to send a chill through me. I laughed it off, blaming my exhaustion. But over the next few days, it got worse. My reflection would blink when I wasn't blinking. It would tilt its head when I was perfectly still. And once, I caught it watching me when I'd already turned away. I started avoiding the mirror, but curiosity got the better of me. One night, I decided to test it. I raised my right hand. The reflection followed. I wiggled my fingers. It copied me. But when I lowered my hand, it didn't. It just stood there, hand raised, fingers still twitching. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I stepped closer, staring into my own eyes. My reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The reflection's grin widened, its teeth stretching too far, its lips curling unnaturally. Then the light flickered. Just once. When it came back on, my reflection was normal again. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I avoided the mirror completely. But as I was leaving for work, something made me glance at it. The reflection was standing there, watching. And this time, it wasn't me. I ran. I left the apartment, heart hammering. I told myself I'd get rid of the mirror that night no matter what. But when I returned, the mirror was gone. The wall was bare, as if it had never been there at all. That was a week ago. I should feel relieved. But every night, just as I'm falling asleep, I hear something whisper my name from the other side of the glass. It started with a simple invitation. "Hey, want to spend the weekend at my family's old lake house?" Sarah's text popped up on my phone late Friday evening. I hadn't seen her in months, and the idea of escaping to a remote lake sounded perfect. The drive wasn't long, but the last stretch was unsettling. The road leading to the house was narrow and lined with towering trees that seemed to press in from both sides, blocking out the sky. The sun had long since set by the time I finally reached the cabin. Sarah was waiting at the door with a warm smile, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her younger brother, Ben, helped carry my bags inside. The house was charming in a rustic way, wood-paneled walls, creaking floorboards, and a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. But something about the stillness felt off. That night, we gathered by the fire, swapping stories about our childhood trips to the lake. Sarah was animated, her eyes lighting up with each memory, but Ben sat quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on the shadows flickering across the walls. "Ben, are you okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. He shrugged but didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out an old battered journal. "Found this in the attic," he said, handing it to Sarah. "Thought it was just an old family scrapbook." She flipped through the pages, her expression quickly shifting from curious to uneasy. "These aren't family stories," she said softly. The journal was filled with tales of the lake and its surroundings, stories of whispers in the dark, figures standing at the edge of the woods, eyes watching from the water. "We've heard these before," Sarah added, trying to sound nonchalant, though her voice wavered slightly. "Just old ghost stories." But Ben's eyes were locked on something further in the journal. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an entry that had been hastily scrawled in darker ink. "They come when the moon is highest. They walk silently, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They stand by the shore and call to you." The room grew colder, the fire flickering unnaturally. "Let's close it," I said, pushing the journal back toward Ben. "Maybe it's just a local legend." But Sarah was already turning the next page. The writing wasn't as smooth this time. It was frantic, almost desperate. "They wait until you sleep. They enter through the dreams, whispering your name until you wake, helpless, to move. We stared at the page in silence, the air thick with unease. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Suddenly, the sound of water lapping against the shore echoed through the night. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice low. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah suggested quickly. The warmth of the fire felt distant, the shadows twisting in ways they shouldn't. I awoke hours later, my body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only sound the steady hum of the wind. My phone displayed 3:03 a.m. The air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. Then I heard it, faint whispers from the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. "Sarah?" I called out hoarsely, but the words barely left my mouth. No response. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices weaving through the stillness, saying things I couldn't understand. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt pinned down, paralyzed by the suffocating darkness. Suddenly, a faint figure appeared at the edge of the room, a shadow with hollow eyes and a pale, distorted face. It wasn't human. Its mouth moved silently, but I could feel it calling my name, over and over again. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My vision blurred, and the whispering grew louder, consuming everything. Then, as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. The figure disappeared. The room returned to silence. I gasped for air, my chest heaving. When I opened my eyes again, the faintest glow of dawn was creeping through the window. My limbs felt like they were on fire, but I could move. I stumbled out of bed, checking the room. Sarah and Ben were still, sound asleep. I couldn't wake them, no matter how hard I tried. Their faces were calm, peaceful, as if they weren't really there. Panicked, I ran outside. The lake stretched before me, calm and serene. But something was off. The stillness was unnatural, too complete. I circled back to the cabin, my breath coming in short bursts. The journal was gone. By the time Sarah and Ben woke up, I couldn't explain what had happened. All I knew was that something had reached inside my dreams, pulling me into a nightmare where no one could save me. And even though the house stood untouched, the lake still whispered my name beneath the surface. It had been years since I last visited my grandparents' old house in the countryside. After they passed away, the house sat empty, and the forest that surrounded it seemed to close in on the place, whispering secrets only the trees knew. When my parents suggested we return to clear out some of their belongings, I hesitated but agreed. There was something about the old place that still pulled at me. The house was a large, decrepit structure with faded paint and broken shutters. The silence inside was oppressive, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The forest loomed beyond the backyard, stretching endlessly into the distance. It had always been unsettling, too quiet, too dark, and today it felt even more so. As we worked through the rooms, sorting through forgotten memories and decades-old clutter, I stumbled upon a room I didn't remember. The door was slightly ajar, the faint sound of rusted hinges echoing softly as I pushed it open. Inside was a dusty, long-forgotten library. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and mildew. Among the cobwebbed bookshelves, I found a journal. Its cover was made of rough, bark-like leather, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The handwriting was meticulous, but the words made my stomach turn. The woods do not welcome strangers. They know your secrets before you do. They whisper your name, sometimes aloud, sometimes in your mind. I flipped the page. The entries were more disturbing. Stories of travelers lost in the forest, their bodies never found. Of footsteps in the snow that led nowhere. Of voices heard calling in the dark. It was the kind of writing that made the air in the room grow, colder with each word. I called out to my parents, but the sound barely echoed back. The rest of the house felt distant, as though the walls themselves were trying to push us away. The journal slipped from my hands and I couldn't help but glance out the window. The woods looked darker than before, the trees shifting subtly as though watching. That night we sat in the living room, the fire crackling feebly. The house creaked and groaned around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the windows, hidden in the shadows. Every sound, the wind, the distant rustling of leaves, felt deliberate, as if it was drawing closer. Then I heard it, a soft, breathy whisper. My name. Not from the wind, not from my parents, but inside my head. I froze, the hairs on my arms, standing on end. "Hello?" I whispered back, but no response came. Hours passed and the silence became unbearable. My parents seemed unaware, lost in their conversation, but I could feel something watching me, waiting. The house was no longer a refuge, it was a prison. Suddenly, a heavy knock echoed from upstairs. It was a late autumn evening when we stumbled upon the quiet fields. We were driving back from a remote mountain town, seeking a place to rest for the night. The road had twisted and turned through dense forests and narrow valleys until finally opening into a vast expanse of farmland. The fields stretched on endlessly under the fading light, broken only by the occasional silhouette of a farmhouse or barn. "Let's pull over here," Jessica said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her expression betrayed unease. The others agreed without much hesitation, and we parked the car near the edge of a vast wheat field. It was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of dry leaves in the wind. There were no animals, no distant sounds of life, just the faint hum of the engine as we sat in stillness. "I don't like it here," Mike said, adjusting the rearview mirror. "Feels like something's watching." "You're just being paranoid," Karen scoffed. "It's just an empty field." But I couldn't shake the feeling either. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. We stepped out of the car, stretching and looking around. The sun had long set, and the horizon seemed to blur into the dark sky. Every shadow seemed deeper, as if the field swallowed the light itself. We set up camp near the edge of the field. The strange silence continued. There was no sound of animals, no wind chimes or rustling of leaves. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that made your skin crawl. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jessica shivered and nodded, her eyes scanning the distance. "It's not just you." A soft breeze stirred the air, but there was something unnatural about it. The rustling in the fields wasn't from wind. It sounded like movement. Slow, deliberate steps, rushing through the tall wheat stalks. The sound echoed in our ears, amplifying with each passing second. "Hello," Mike called out nervously, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the stillness. Suddenly, from deep within the fields, a figure emerged, a silhouette against the dark horizon. It moved with a smooth, unnatural gait, blending into the shadows, making it impossible to discern its features. The figure wasn't human, at least not in the way we knew. It was faceless, but its eyes gleamed faintly in the darkness, a pair of deep, hollow voids staring at us. A deep, raspy breath escaped its unseen mouth, a sound that made the hair on our necks stand on end. The presence radiated something malevolent, something ancient and twisted. "Run!" Jessica screamed, her voice cracking in panic. We bolted, toward the car. But the figure moved impossibly fast, weaving through the fields as though part of the very ground. Its pace was relentless, closing the distance faster than we could comprehend. I fumbled with the car keys, trying to unlock the door, but the sound of its breathing was already behind us. The field seemed to grow darker, the shadows more intense, pressing in on us like a living nightmare. At the last second, I managed to slam the car door shut. The engine roared to life as we sped down the empty road, leaving the figure far behind us in the silent abyss of the fields. We drove for what felt like hours, never looking back. The fields receded into the distance, leaving nothing but darkness. in our rearview mirrors. None of us spoke, too shaken by what we had seen. To this day, we still wonder what it was, if it was ever truly there at all, or if the quiet fields had somehow reached out to consume us. It was late evening when we left the small town behind. The sun had long since set, leaving the horizon a dull orange glow as we drove down the winding country road. The headlights barely cut through the dense trees lining either side, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and pine. Just a few of us had decided on this spontaneous road trip. My best friend Rachel sat beside me in the passenger seat, while our two friends, Ben and Lisa, followed behind in a separate car. The road had been quiet for miles. No other cars, no signs of life. The distant hum of cicadas was the only sound. "It's getting darker," Rachel said, her voice tense. "Maybe we should stop soon." "We're fine," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "There's a small town up ahead, right?" I checked the GPS again, but the signal had been spotty for the last hour. It kept flashing between bars, as though the road itself was swallowing the signal. I sighed, turning the volume down on the radio. Static hissed, occasionally punctuated by distant whispers I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, the car jolted slightly. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop on the side of the road. "What the hell?" I whispered, looking down at the dashboard. A deep scratch ran along the side of the car, an unnatural, jagged mark. "What was that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. We both stepped out of the car to inspect the damage. Nothing was visible in the darkness, no branches, no debris, just the scratch. "Must have been a rock or something," I said, though I wasn't convinced. As we stood there, I noticed Ben and Lisa's car pulling up behind us. They were clearly shaken, too. "We saw something," Lisa said quietly, her voice shaking. "On the road. A figure, walking slowly. But there was nothing there when we checked." Rachel and I exchanged a glance, uneasy. The silence seemed to deepen again. The trees seemed to close in, shadows twisting unnaturally as the wind rustled through the leaves. "Let's just keep moving," I urged, though I wasn't sure if that was the right decision. The road ahead was even darker, more isolated. We drove in tense silence, but no matter how far we went, it felt like we were going in circles. The road didn't seem to end. The GPS was completely frozen now, the screen showing a blank map with no roads, no towns, just an endless expanse of black. Every now and then, we caught glimpses of something at the edge of the headlights, a shadow, a silhouette, fleeting and elusive, barely discernible before vanishing completely. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching. "Did you see that?" Rachel asked, gripping my arm tightly as we passed a bend. Her voice shook. I didn't need to ask what she was talking about. Every turn, every glance into the rearview mirror was met with unease. Finally, the road straightened out and there was a slight incline ahead. The headlights flickered again as we crested the hill, and that's when we saw it, the figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was too tall, too thin, and the features were distorted, lacking a clear face, just an empty, shifting void. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like something inhuman was attempting to walk forward. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure loomed closer, stepping toward us. We could feel its presence, almost tangible in the suffocating air. The static on the radio surged louder, an inhuman scream cutting through the noise before fading again into eerie silence. "We have to get out of here," I managed to say, my voice a whisper. My hands were trembling as I put the car in reverse, tires squealing as I sped backward. The figure didn't follow, at least not immediately, but the fear that it was still there, waiting in the darkness, haunted us. We didn't stop until we found a small roadside motel, miles down the highway. The place was no safer. Creaky floors, flickering lights, and an air of oppressive stillness. But we didn't care. We just needed to put distance between us and whatever we saw. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened on that road. The memory haunts us, an endless, silent expanse of darkness and something beyond our understanding. It was a quiet, remote campsite surrounded by dense forest and a shallow, still lake. The sun dipped below the horizon early, leaving the sky painted in shades of deep purple and orange. My friends and I had set up camp near the water, far from civilization, and we were eager to escape the noise of city life for a weekend of peace and nature. The first night was peaceful until the sounds began. At first, it was subtle, a faint splashing from the middle of the lake, like something brushing against the surface. We chalked it up to the wind or some wandering animal, but the noises persisted even after midnight. A soft, rhythmic sound, like a slow, steady heartbeat. We stayed near the fire, trying to ignore the unease creeping into our bones. The shadows of the trees flickered in the flickering flames, creating haunting shapes against the dark, still water. "Does anyone else hear that?" Sam asked, his voice hushed, his eyes fixed on the lake. We all listened. The splashing grew louder, a sound almost like breathing, long, slow inhales and exhales echoing across the still surface. "Maybe it's a fish," Emily suggested, though. None of us sounded convinced, but it wasn't just the lake that seemed off. The forest was silent, too silent. Even the usual rustling of leaves was replaced with stillness, a heavy, suffocating quiet. The air grew colder, biting at our skin. Then something unnatural emerged. A figure, standing at the edge of the water. It was faceless, obscured in shadow, its body a dark, shifting mass. Long, thin arms reached out toward the water as though trying to pull something beneath the surface. Its movements were slow, deliberate, human, yet wrong in every sense. We were frozen in place. I fumbled for my phone, my flashlight illuminating a momentary glimpse, but it only made the figure seem more surreal, a black void against the shimmering lake. "Run!" I choked out, but my voice was barely a whisper. The figure began moving, toward us. Fast, too fast for something unnatural. We bolted, tripping over roots and scrambling through the forest. The splashing sounds followed, closer than before. Each footstep echoed behind us, the breathing growing louder with every stride. My breath came in short bursts, panic seizing my chest. After what felt like hours, we burst back into camp, collapsing near the fire. The sound of the lake seemed to recede, but we didn't dare look back. The shadows were deep, the stillness oppressive. We sat there, huddled, until dawn broke through the trees. The figure was gone, but the hollow lake remained, dark and silent, a place we never dared return to. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the edge of the forest, a dense, ancient expanse stretching far beyond what we could see. My friends and I were on a camping trip, seeking adventure away from the familiar world. The air was crisp, and the sun pierced through the canopy in sporadic beams. The forest seemed peaceful, but something felt off. We set up our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees with gnarled branches. The sounds of nature were soothing at first, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird. But as night approached, a strange stillness settled in. The woods were silent, almost too quiet, as though even the animals avoided the area. As we sat around the fire, eating our meals, we began to notice the whispers. At first, it was faint, a distant murmur like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. Words we couldn't quite make out, voices we couldn't pinpoint. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," I said, though my stomach churned with unease. "Just the wind." But the wind didn't explain the chilling way the whispers seemed to form sentences. Phrases like, "You shouldn't have come," and "leave," floated through the air, winding between the trees. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually grew louder. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sounds. But no matter how loudly we talked or laughed, the whispers never ceased. They followed us, weaving through the branches, becoming louder with every passing minute. Suddenly, one of my friends, Marcus, shouted, "Stop! Stop whispering!" His voice echoed through the still night. The whispers paused, and for a moment, the woods felt utterly silent. But then they came back, closer now, more desperate. They weren't just voices anymore. They were inhuman, guttural, almost like something wrong. I scrambled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed, their twisted shapes casting unnaturally long shadows. The whispers became screams, not of rage or anger, but of despair, a haunting chorus of agony and sorrow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently, almost dying out as though being consumed by the darkness. Panic surged through us. Emily screamed, dropping her belongings as we rushed toward the tents. We couldn't run. Our feet seemed rooted to the ground. The whispers intensified into deafening howls, and something slithered through the edges of the light, dark shapes twisting in and out of view. The forest seemed alive. Its branches stretched, its roots pulling at the earth as though reaching for something hidden. I turned back to the clearing, gasping for breath, and saw it, a silhouette, pale and gaunt, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Its eyes were hollow, voids of blackness staring into my soul. "Leave," it hissed, and its voice was not human, not animal, something far worse. It wasn't a sound at all, but a presence, a force so malevolent it tore through the very fabric of reality. A blinding light erupted from my flashlight as I screamed, and in that moment of pure terror, everything vanished. When I awoke, the fire had gone out. My friends were gone. The whispers still echo in my mind. It was just a normal evening. Cool air, the distant hum of cars on the street. I left the office late, the city lights dimming as I walked down an empty alley toward my apartment. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The usual buzz of nightlife had faded, leaving nothing but silence. As I approached the end of the alley, a figure emerged from the shadows. They stood still, watching me. My heart quickened, but I tried to stay calm. There was something unnatural about their stance. Still too deliberate. They wore a long, dark coat, and the face beneath the hood was hidden in shadow. "Hey," I said cautiously, slowing my pace. "Are you lost?" No answer. The figure took a slow step forward. Another. I started to back away, but my foot hit something sharp in the dirt. I looked down. It was a pocket mirror, cracked and stained with dirt. My breath caught. There was something inside the glass, something twisted, grotesque, and it wasn't my reflection. Panic surged through me. I spun around to run, but the figure was there again, impossibly close. Their voice was a low whisper, distorted, like it came from miles away. "You shouldn't have looked." The darkness around us seemed to press in, swallowing the streetlight. Glow. I stumbled, backing toward the alley wall. The figure stepped even closer. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. Then the air shifted, a chill so cold it felt like a knife to my skin. The sound of whispers filled the alley. Dozens of voices, millions of voices, echoing in unison. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body rigid with fear. The figure raised their hand, and from beneath the hood, a mouthless face emerged. A void, nothing more than darkness. They opened it, and the whispers intensified. I couldn't hear anything else. No traffic, no distant noise, just that suffocating, oppressive silence. "Don't look away," the voice said again. This time, it was inside my mind. But I couldn't. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I tried to push forward. The figure, the void, was the only thing I could see, pulling me into the depths of that unholy darkness. And then it all went black. It was late summer when we stumbled across the old watermill. We had been hiking for hours, deep into the woods, chasing the sound of a distant river. The sun had begun to dip low, casting long shadows across the overgrown trail. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The watermill was a relic of the past. Decaying wooden beams, moss-covered stone walls, and a rusted water wheel that turned sluggishly with no water to power it. Its windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged ominously in places, but there was something oddly captivating about it. We had to take a look. Inside, the air was musty and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Dust floated in the dim light, disturbed only by our footsteps. It felt as though we had stepped into another time, one that held on to secrets best left buried. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Our voices seemed to be swallowed by the ancient wood. The room we entered had a broken table at its center, with chairs overturned and papers scattered across the floor. A fireplace at the back was long extinguished, the hearth now home to nothing but ash and cobwebs. "Let's head back," Jenna whispered. Her voice trembled slightly. "Just a little. Farther," I urged, though even I was starting to feel uneasy. The feeling of being watched weighed on me, though there was no one else around. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed, a voice, distant and hollow, coming from the darkness beyond the room. It was soft, barely audible, but it made my skin crawl. I strained my ears to hear more, but only silence returned. "What was that?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "I don't know," James said, his face pale. "Let's leave. Now." As we turned back, the old water wheel gave a slow creak, a sound almost too faint to hear. But it didn't stop. It began to move faster, turning in jerky, unnatural motions, though there was no water to drive it. The eerie noise echoed through, the mill, louder and more distorted, sending shivers down our spines. "Run!" I yelled, and we didn't hesitate. We sprinted toward the entrance, the rusted door creaking behind us, inching shut. The sound of the water wheel increased until it was a deafening hum. Jenna screamed as we reached the exit, the door slamming shut behind us just as we burst out into the clearing. We collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the sound of the water wheel slowly faded into the night. The mill was silent once again. We never went back. It started as a peaceful getaway. My girlfriend and I had rented a secluded cottage in the countryside, a charming old place surrounded by rolling hills and a garden that stretched far beyond the property's boundaries. The garden was beautiful. At first glance, wildflowers in full bloom, a stone path winding its way through thick hedges, and an ancient, twisted tree at its center. But as night fell, something shifted. We explored the garden that afternoon, wandering through rows of overgrown plants. There was a strange sense of timelessness, as though the garden wasn't part of the present day. The air grew cooler, and the silence became suffocating. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the hum of insects in the distance. That evening, as we sat on the cottage porch, the sun dipped below the horizon. The garden, once beautiful, began to look eerie. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence deepened into a haunting stillness. My phone had no signal, and the cottage lights flickered faintly whenever a breeze passed through. "We should head back in," I said, my voice a little shaky. My girlfriend nodded, but as we rose to leave, a low, guttural whisper floated through. "The garden." "Stay," it said, smooth and menacing. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My girlfriend clutched my arm tightly, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" I think it's the wind," I managed to say, but even as I spoke, we both knew it wasn't. The whisper came again, this time louder, deeper. It seemed to come from the twisted tree at the garden's center. Stay. With me. Fear gripped us both as we stumbled back toward the cottage. The path behind us was overrun with vines, the trees seeming to lean in closer, their branches clawing toward us. The garden's beauty had become something grotesque, a maze of shadows, shifting shapes hidden just beyond sight. Inside the cottage, the windows were locked, the doors secured, but we could still hear it, faint breathing from beyond the walls, hollow laughter, and the whisper of, "Stay." "We need to get out," I whispered urgently, my voice trembling. The lights flickered again, this time fading entirely. The whispers intensified, louder and more desperate. Suddenly, we heard it, an unnatural sound, as if something was moving inside the walls, slithering through the wood like a predator. The cottage shook slightly as if the garden itself was reaching for us. The whispers became frantic, almost pleading. "I won't let you leave," a voice echoed, low, sinister, almost familiar. Panic overtook us. My girlfriend screamed as we slammed open the front door and sprinted back toward the car. The garden was alive, twisting, moving, and snarling in the dark. The ancient tree seemed to loom over us, its branches writhing like dark, clawed tendrils. As we tore down the driveway, the garden shrunk behind us, retreating into the shadows. But we knew it was still there, watching, waiting. It was an ordinary evening when my husband and I decided to take a walk through the woods near our new home. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. We had moved here just a few weeks ago, and the quiet seclusion had been one of the main reasons for choosing this area. The woods were vast, with tall, twisted trees stretching toward the sky. We followed a narrow path that curved around a small, stagnant pond. The air was cool and still, and everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was strange how the forest seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "We should turn back soon," I said, squeezing my husband's hand. His grip tightened slightly as we moved deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, we heard a faint humming. It wasn't coming from any direction we could identify. It was low, rhythmic, like a chant that seemed to pulse in sync with the trees. The air grew colder, heavier, and I began to feel uneasy. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my husband replied, his voice strained. The humming grew louder. It was like a song we couldn't understand, the words slithering around in the darkness. We paused, holding our breath, listening. The forest seemed alive, too alive. Every shadow moved slightly, shifting shapes that were impossible to make out. Suddenly, the path ahead seemed to narrow, the trees closing in on us. The woods felt like a living, breathing entity, and we were lost within it. My phone had no signal, and the sky had turned an unnatural shade of deep blue. A low growl echoed behind us. My husband turned quickly, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there, just more trees. Yet the sound continued, closer now, a raspy, guttural sound that chilled my bones. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, urgency thick in his even voice. We started walking faster, the hum still surrounding us, getting louder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the cold hands of fear gripping at my throat. Then I saw it, a figure, tall, shadowy, and humanoid, standing at the edge of the trail. Its eyes glowed faintly, a pale, unnatural light cutting through the darkness. I stopped, frozen, unable to move. My husband called my name, his voice distant as if underwater. The figure began to move, slowly at first, its long, thin arms extending toward us. The humming reached a fever pitch, vibrating in the air like a symphony of madness. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred as if something was bending reality itself around us. "Run!" my husband yelled, yanking me forward. We sprinted through. The woods, the figure always just behind us, its presence closing in. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear its whispering voice in my mind. "You're mine now." We didn't stop. The path twisted and turned endlessly, but somehow we kept moving forward. The humming finally faded, and the creature's presence slowly receded, retreating back into the shadows. Breathless and trembling, we broke through the tree line into the clearing near the pond. The sound of the forest was gone, leaving only the distant croak of a frog. My husband dropped to his knees, gasping for air, as I collapsed beside him. What was that?" I whispered. He shook his head, eyes wide. "Something we shouldn't have found." The hollow woods were still. It was a summer evening when my friends and I set out on a spontaneous camping trip into the woods. We found an old, abandoned cabin deep in the forest, something we'd heard whispered about but never truly believed existed. The sun was setting. As we arrived, casting long, shadowy figures across the overgrown clearing where the cabin stood. The wooden structure was weathered. Its roof caved in on one side, ivy and moss clung to the sides, and the windows were broken, leaving empty, dark spaces that seemed to peer back at us. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. "I read somewhere this place used to be used by hunters," Jamie said, kicking a loose board near the doorframe. "It's falling apart," Ryan added, looking at the crumbling porch. "Are you sure this is safe?" But curiosity had already set in. We pushed open the door slowly, the rusty hinges groaning as they moved. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, with furniture covered in sheets of cobwebs. A thin layer of dust blanketed everything, and the air felt colder the moment we crossed the threshold. "Let's set up in here," Alex suggested. "This is way more interesting than a plain campsite." We made ourselves comfortable by the fireplace, the only source of light coming from a few battery-powered lanterns. As the night grew deeper, the wind began to howl through the trees, sending eerie whispers against the broken walls. That's when the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling, like something moving behind the thin wooden walls. We chalked it up to small creatures, but as the night dragged on, the sounds became more pronounced. Footsteps creaked above us, slow and deliberate, shifting across the attic space. Each step seemed to echo through the cabin, even though no one was there, I think. "Someone's up there," Jamie whispered, her voice trembling. "Shh," I said, pressing a finger to my lips, but my breath caught in my throat as the footsteps moved closer, louder now, as if they were approaching the door. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath us groaned like they were alive. We all froze, the sound of our own breathing deafening. Then there was a knock, soft at first, barely audible, but repeated, louder and faster with every beat. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming, from inside the cabin, but there was nothing, no one, to make the sound. Ryan reached for his flashlight, shaking. "There's something in here," he whispered. "We need to leave," Alex said, his voice firm but trembling. "Now." We gathered our things quickly, moving as quietly as possible, but just as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The knocking continued, this time right behind us, somewhere inside the cabin. "Open it!" Jamie screamed, banging against the door, but no matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were covered with an unnatural fog, making it impossible to see outside. The knocking grew faster, more frantic, and the floor beneath us began to shake as if someone, was moving beneath it. Panic took over. We clawed at the walls, desperate to escape, but it was useless. The cabin's darkness swallowed us whole, and the knocking became deafening, an unrelenting symphony of terror. And then, silence. When we woke up, the sun had risen. The cabin was empty once more, not a trace of what had happened the night before. The floor was untouched, and the door was still closed as if nothing had ever happened. But we knew the truth. Something had been with us that night, watching, waiting, and it had no intention of letting us leave again. Last winter, my friends and I rented a remote lodge in the mountains. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, just snowboarding, hot cocoa, and the crackling warmth of a fireplace. The lodge was nestled deep in the forest, far from any other people, and the snowstorm that hit on the first night made sure we were completely cut off. The place was massive, 3 stories tall with creaky wooden floors, dark hallways, and antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The first night was cozy. We sat by the fire, played board games, and told ghost stories. But as the storm raged outside, something started to feel wrong. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming, on a window. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a branch hitting the glass in the wind. But when I checked, there was no branch, and the window was perfectly still. The next morning, my friend Claire said she'd heard footsteps in the hallway during the night. They were slow, like someone was pacing, she said, laughing nervously. We joked about the lodge being haunted, but her unease stuck with me. That evening, the power went out. It wasn't surprising, given the storm, but the timing felt off. The fireplace was still roaring, so we gathered around it, using flashlights and lanterns to light the room. The howling wind outside made the old house groan and creak like it was alive. While we sat there, we heard a loud thud upstairs. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was deliberate, like something heavy had been dropped. We all froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" Ethan whispered. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep everyone calm. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Another sound followed, this one sharper, a dragging noise like furniture being pulled across the floor. It came from the 3rd floor, the part of the house we hadn't explored yet. Against my better judgment, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the 3rd floor. The air was colder up there, and the hallways felt narrower, the shadows darker. We checked every room. Old bedrooms, storage spaces, but they were all empty. Finally, we reached the last door, at the very end of the hall. It was locked. "Let's just go back downstairs," Claire pleaded, but Ethan was already fiddling with the doorknob. With a loud snap, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor, around the chair, were deep scratches, as if it had been dragged back and forth for years. The air smelled foul, like rotting wood and mildew. On the far wall was a mirror, cracked and dusty. As we stepped inside, our flashlight beams bounced off the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside the reflection. Something that wasn't us. "Do you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. We stared at the mirror. The room behind us was empty, but in the reflection there was a figure sitting in the chair. It was pale, hunched, and facing away from us. Ethan shone his flashlight directly at the chair. It was empty. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, like it had been slammed by an unseen hand. The mirror's reflection shifted. The figure stood up, slowly turning to face us. Its face was blank, featureless, yet its presence was overwhelming. It stepped closer in the reflection, though nothing moved in the room. Then the glass shattered. We screamed, bolting for the door. It wouldn't budge. The air grew icy and the walls seemed to close in. Behind us, I heard the faint sound of footsteps. Soft. At first, then heavier, faster, coming straight toward us. Just as the door finally gave way, the room plunged into silence. We stumbled back down the stairs, hearts racing. No one spoke for the rest of the night, and we left the lodge the moment the storm cleared. I don't know what we saw in that mirror, or why it was there. but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint sound of a chair dragging across the floor. The town had long forgotten about the old toy shop. It sat on the edge of a narrow, winding street, its windows covered in dust, the faded sign barely hanging by a rusted hinge. No one ventured there anymore. The stories had spread long ago. Whispers of toys coming to life in the dead of night, their giggles heard when the shop was empty. But no one believed them. Until now. It was just supposed to be a quick visit. My cousin, Alex, and I had stumbled upon the shop while wandering through the town. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, a mix of old wood and forgotten memories. I pushed open the door. It creaked loudly like a scream echoing through the stillness. Inside, the place was a maze of shelves stacked with toys. Dolls, wooden, soldiers, stuffed animals, all worn and broken in strange ways. The lighting was dim, flickering as if uncertain whether it wanted to work. "This place is creepy," Alex whispered, his voice echoing against the silent walls. "No one's been here for years," I said. "It's just old." We moved cautiously through the aisles, checking each toy. Many were missing limbs, their expressions contorted into strange, unnerving smiles. One doll had cracked porcelain skin, its hollow eyes staring directly at us. Another, a clown figure, had a red nose that seemed to drip slowly with something dark, possibly paint or something worse. Then we heard the first giggle, a soft, high-pitched laugh echoing through the shop. "Did you hear that?" Alex's voice shook. I nodded, but no words came out. It had sounded close, like it had come from behind us. But when we turned, there was nothing. Only the lifeless toys, their glassy eyes following us in the dim light. "Let's get out of here," I said, my breath quickening. But as we made our way toward the door, it slammed shut behind us. I yelped, spinning around. The shop was darker, now. Too dark. The flickering lights went out completely. We were plunged into absolute silence, save for the soft creaks of wooden shelves settling. Another giggle, louder this time, rose up in the shadows. It seemed to come from everywhere. The toys on the shelves began to move, slightly at first, a doll's arm twitching, a small bear shifting its head. But then they began to move more deliberately. "Stay still," Alex whispered, panic clear, in his voice. The clown doll turned its head fully toward us, its painted grin widening. The wooden soldiers lined up on the shelves shifted into a formation, as though preparing for battle. "We have to get out," I said again, my voice cracking. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on, but it barely illuminated the shop. The shadows moved faster now, darting between the aisles, more giggles rising from unseen corners. "Where's the exit?" Alex shouted, his flashlight flaring briefly before dying. Suddenly, from behind us, the sound of tiny footsteps echoed. I spun around just in time to see the smallest of the dolls, a porcelain boy, its cracked face tilted up toward us, its tiny chipped lips forming words. "Play with us," it said in a voice so soft it made my skin crawl. "No," I screamed, backing into a shelf. The toys surged forward, dolls clattering off shelves, bears waddling across the floor, and even smaller, shadowy figures emerging from the corners, their twisted faces grimacing with delight. The giggles turned into a chorus, louder and more chilling as they surrounded us. Every direction we turned, there were more of them, living shadows with cracked, lifeless eyes. Then the clown's voice boomed above the others. "Play. Forever." My heart raced as Alex and I pushed against the door, throwing all our weight into it. The giggles grew deafening, filling every inch of the shop. We didn't dare look back. Finally, the door gave way and we stumbled into the street. The shop was still there, still dark, but no movement. The toys remained frozen, lifeless. Once more, we didn't wait to see if they would wake again. Breathing hard, we ran. Down the street, past the empty houses, away from the forgotten toy shop that would haunt our memories forever. We were lucky to escape, but the shop, it still stands, waiting, always waiting. It had been years since anyone had dared venture near the old well at the edge of town. The stories surrounding it were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange sounds, vanished hikers, and eerie lights that flickered in the dead of night. Most people avoided the well, not out of fear, but out of respect for the ominous legends. But curiosity got the better of me. One late autumn evening, after hearing so many eerie tales, I decided to visit the well alone. My friends had all warned me not to go, but I couldn't resist. The town's ancient history called to me, and the thought of uncovering some forgotten mystery was too tempting. The path to the well was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots. Darkness cloaked the forest, the trees leaning in like they had stories to tell. It was cold, so cold that even my breath formed thick clouds in the air. The faint glimmer of the well came into view as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Well itself was old, crumbling stone with a rusted metal bucket sitting awkwardly in its center. The air felt heavy, unnatural, a sense of dread wrapping around my chest. A dim, flickering lantern hung from the well's side, casting strange shadows that twisted unnaturally in the dark. I set my flashlight on the ground and leaned in close to inspect it. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bottom, a slow, monotonous drip that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the well. It came from behind me, from deeper within the woods. It was a woman's voice, soft yet chilling, almost melodic. She was saying something, but the words were indistinct, like they were spoken in a language, lost to time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I turned back toward the well, gripping my flashlight tightly. The chill deepened and the shadows seemed to shift once again, moving closer, circling the well. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not driven by wind or natural causes. The lantern flickered harder, its flame sputtering as if something unseen was feeding on it. I reached down to retrieve my flashlight, but as my hand brushed the cold metal, I saw it. Faces, hundreds of them, distorted and gray, pressed against the surface of the water at the bottom of the well. The faces were crying. Silent tears slid down their features, blending into the dark water. Their mouths were twisted in expressions of pain and longing, and their eyes, oh, their eyes, hollow, empty, and searching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping the silence. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me now, voices overlapping and blending into a terrifying symphony of sorrow. I could hear them pleading, crying out, voices from the well, calling for something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't realize how far I had retreated until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The shadows closed in, their form no longer shapes, but human-like figures. Long, gaunt, with hollow faces and lifeless eyes. Their fingers reached out, elongated and grotesque, dragging across the surface of the well, clawing toward me. "Please," I begged, lifting the flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, pushing them back, but they came closer as if drawn to the light. "Leave!" I screamed, feeling my legs give out beneath me. The figures paused at the edge of the light. They stared at me, not with malice, but with despair. Then they began to fade into the shadows once more, their hollow eyes lingering in the darkness. When I looked back at the well, it was still, silent again, save for the slow drip of water. But the faces remained beneath the surface, watching, always watching. I stumbled back through the forest, my legs shaking, my breath uneven. The well was still behind me, a hollow abyss waiting, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to look inside. And I knew some mysteries should never be uncovered. It was a place I stumbled upon quite by accident. Deep in the industrial outskirts of the city, hidden behind a row of overgrown weeds and old fences, was a workshop. A rusty sign hung askew above the door, its paint faded and chipped beyond recognition. The windows were shattered, and the metal door creaked ominously when I pushed it open. The inside was a maze of forgotten tools, wrenches, saws, and strange machines that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and dust covered every surface like a thick gray blanket. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I was curious. Everyone had told me to stay away from the workshop, that it had been condemned long ago, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, documenting the decay for some unknown reason. But something didn't feel right. Every photo I took showed more than just machinery or broken tools. The shadows in the background seemed to move, subtly at first, but unmistakably shifting. Figures were hidden in the corners of my shots, just out of view when I glanced at the screen. I didn't think much of it until I heard something. A whisper, low, guttural, and chilling. "Stay," it said. The voice was unlike anything human, warped and distorted as though it was coming from the walls themselves. I froze. My breath hitched and I turned slowly, expecting to see someone. No one was there, only the echoes of my footsteps tapping against the concrete floor. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Stay." A cold wave of dread washed over me. I quickly began to backtrack toward the door, my phone's flashlight flickering as I moved. Each step I took seemed heavier, like the air was thickening, pressing down on me. Then I noticed something strange. The shadows weren't just shifting, they were moving toward me, as though the darkness itself had become alive, slithering across the floor like black tendrils. They crept between the tools, between the broken machines, gathering strength as they closed in. "Get out!" I screamed, but my voice barely escaped my lips. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, merging into a cacophony of distorted voices. The door behind me slammed shut. I spun around in terror, only to see the shadows pooling at my feet. They rose, climbing the walls like ink bleeding from unseen cracks, twisting into grotesque forms. Faces, hundreds of them, formed from the blackness, mouths contorted in silent screams. I lifted my camera again, desperate to capture something, anything, before the darkness swallowed me whole. But the photos, they weren't pictures anymore. They showed fragments of reality. Machines vibrating unnaturally, faces appearing in mirrors that hadn't been there seconds before, and something standing behind me in the reflection. A creature, monstrous and faceless, whispering into my ear. "Stay," it hissed. The last thing I remember is the darkness enveloping me entirely, the whispers growing so loud that they consumed all other sound. When the morning light broke through the workshop's windows, I was gone. Nothing remained but a handful of photographs scattered on the floor, each one corrupted beyond recognition, except for one. In that single photograph, my reflection stared back at the camera, its eyes hollow and dark, a twisted grin curling across its mouth. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to escape the city and get lost in nature. My friends and I packed everything we needed: tents, sleeping bags, flashlights, and a few board games to pass the time. We headed deep into the forest, far from the nearest trail. No cell service, no signals, just us and the wilderness. We found a clearing by a small, still lake, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling our lungs. It was peaceful at first. That night, around the campfire, the stories began. Nothing unusual at first, just ghost stories and campfire tales. But as the fire flickered, someone mentioned the abandoned camp across the lake, deep within the woods. "It's been there for years," Alex said, his voice low and hushed. "People say it's cursed. Kids who go there, they don't come back." We all laughed, brushing it off as nonsense. But deep down, the idea stuck with us. The others decided to ignore it, but I couldn't. Curiosity gnawed at me. That same night, after everyone had settled into their tents, I grabbed my flashlight and slipped away from camp. The walk was eerie. The woods were silent, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. The lake shimmered in the moonlight as I approached the other side, the camp looming ahead like a forgotten relic. The first thing I noticed was how empty it felt. The tents were still up, but they were torn, left to rot. Old cooking supplies lay abandoned next to burnt-out campfires. It was like the occupants had vanished overnight. I stepped cautiously through the campsite, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every snap of a twig made me pause. Every shadow stretched unnaturally against the flickering light. A chill ran down my spine as I moved further in. Then I saw it. The building. A long, decrepit mess hall stood at the center of the camp. It had broken windows and a gaping front door. My heart skipped a beat. Despite the absence of life, there was a strange sense of something watching me. Inside, the mess hall was a ruin. The tables had rotted away, the floor warped with decay. The walls were covered in old graffiti, sick drawings, symbols I couldn't recognize, and strange messages scrawled in what looked like dried blood. I moved cautiously through the mess hall, snapping photos with my camera. Each flash illuminated something more disturbing. Shadows flickering in the corners, faint whispers in the dark. My breath quickened. Then the whispers became louder, more distinct. They sounded like children, soft, innocent voices, but their words were unsettling. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, the weight of the darkness pressing against my back. The whispers echoed in my head and every instinct told me to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped. Suddenly, a louder noise, a sharp cracking sound like someone stepping on a branch behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. No one was there. Still, the whispers continued, persistent, growing louder. I swung my flashlight around, desperate for a glimpse of anything. That's when I saw it. The faintest glimpse of a figure in the shadows. A child. Small, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer directly into my soul. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silently watching from the darkness. My breath hitched. I snapped a photo without thinking, and when the flash went off, the child's face contorted, twisted into something grotesque and unnatural. Its smile was too wide, teeth too sharp. It opened its mouth in a silent scream. I bolted. The flashlight flickered and went dark, but I didn't stop running. Behind me, the whispers screamed louder, the child's figure darting from shadow to shadow. I crashed through trees, the forest closing in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw the lake. The shore was a blur in the moonlight, but my tent was in sight. My friends were still there, safe, breathing. I fell into camp, gasping for air. They were startled, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't need to. The fear was still etched into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the forest. As we drove away, I glanced back at the distant lake, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure stood at the edge of the water. The child, watching us, smiling. It had always been a dream of mine to visit the old lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. Lonely and secluded, it stood tall against the crashing waves, weathered by time and the elements. No one had lived there for decades, and the stories surrounding it were enough to keep tourists away. Whispers of strange sounds, shadows moving in the corners of windows, and eerie lights flickering from the tower at night. I had heard those stories, but curiosity won out over fear. With nothing but my camera and a notebook, I set out alone to capture the lighthouse. The journey was long and treacherous, the winding coastal roads cutting through cliffs that seemed to scrape the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun was sinking below the horizon, leaving the sky in a wash of muted colors. The building loomed over me, massive and imposing. Rusted metal stairs spiraled up the side, disappearing into the top of the tower. I knew there was no electricity, no phone signal, and no one for miles. The isolation was absolute. Still, I was eager to explore. Inside, the air was damp and cool. Old furniture, faded and broken, littered the main room. The walls were lined with photographs and journals, evidence that someone had once called this place home. Dust coated everything, settling like a veil over the long-forgotten memories. Flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing down the empty halls. Shadows stretched endlessly in every direction. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, the wind whipping through the open windows. The top of the lighthouse was a narrow room, filled with metal machinery and a glass lens that once guided ships safely through the night. The light had long since died, but the memory of it still hung in the air, a strange, almost tangible presence. I began taking photographs, capturing the decay, the emptiness. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that seems to hum just beyond the ears, a constant, subtle pressure against the senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a whisper in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the wind outside, battering the lighthouse like a living thing. But the sensation only grew stronger, as though something was watching me, just beyond the edge of sight. I glanced around, camera ready, but there was nothing. Still, I kept snapping photos. The lens flared once, casting an eerie glow in the dark. Looking through the viewfinder, I saw something, a pale face in the corner of the frame. It wasn't there in reality, only in the photograph. A ghastly figure, eyes hollow and mouth slack, peering out from the shadows. I froze, unable to move. Shaking, I snapped another shot, but the face wasn't there anymore. It was gone, as if it had never existed. I checked the photos in disbelief, but each one was empty, just the desolate interior of the lighthouse. My breath quickened. Suddenly, a voice echoed softly in the distance, carried on the wind. "Stay." I spun around. "Who's there?" Silence. But that voice, so close, so clear, lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I looked out the windows, scanning the coastline. Nothing but waves crashing against the rocks and the infinite horizon. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I felt exposed, trapped by the vast emptiness. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before flickering back to life. It seemed weaker now, the beam wavering as if struggling against something unseen. I stumbled down the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The lower levels were darker, more enclosed. The wind howled through the windows, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers that grew louder with each step. "Leave," the voice whispered again, closer this time. A breath in my ear, I raced toward the door, fumbling with the rusted handle. My flashlight shut off entirely, plunging the lighthouse into complete darkness. Panic surged through me. I heard footsteps, bare, ragged footsteps, on the wooden floor below. They echoed louder and louder, as though whatever was chasing me was right behind me. "Stay with me," the voice said again, this time more insistent, more menacing. With all my strength, I kicked the door open, stumbling into the night. The heaty sea breeze hit me like a wave, cold and bracing, pushing the whispers away. I ran toward the car, away from the lighthouse. As I sped down the coast, the images flashed through my mind, the face in the photograph, the voice, the footsteps, and I knew. I knew the lighthouse was alive, a place too long abandoned, too tied to something unnatural, something that had never truly left. To this day, I never returned. The lighthouse still stands there, solitary and quiet, but I can't. Forget the shadows that reside within it. Some places I've learned should never be explored. It was a strange dare to begin with. Spend one night in the abandoned watch factory on the edge of town. The place had been shut down decades ago after a fire gutted most of the interior, leaving it a hollow shell of its former self. Locals avoided it, claiming the place was cursed, but I never believed in that kind of thing, and I wasn't about to back out in front of my friends. The factory loomed in the moonlight, its towering smokestacks reaching into the night sky. Broken windows stared down at me like empty eyes, and the faint smell of soot still lingered, even after all these years. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I stepped inside. The air inside was colder than I expected, heavy and still. My footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous space as I wandered through rows of rusted machinery. Pieces of old watches lay scattered across the floor, tiny gears, broken faces, cracked glass. The walls were scorched black in places, and the ceiling above was an intricate lattice of exposed beams and metal. I aimed my flashlight at an old clock mounted on the far wall. It was frozen in time. The hands stuck at precisely 2:17. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned away, heading deeper into the factory. As I explored, strange things began to happen. First, it was the sounds, soft metallic clicks, like gears turning, echoing through the empty space. Then, faint whispers, too distant to make out but unmistakably human. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, scanning the room with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The sound echoed back at me, distorted and hollow. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I pressed on, trying to ignore the rising dread. In one corner of the factory, I found a small office, its door hanging off the hinges. Inside, a desk sat covered in dust, an old ledger open to a page filled with unreadable scribbles. On the wall behind the desk was another clock, identical to the one I'd seen earlier. Its hands were also frozen at 2:17. I took a step back, the hair on my neck standing on end. That was when I heard it, a faint ticking sound, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the office, but from somewhere deeper in the factory. The sound pulled me forward, almost against my will. As I moved closer, the ticking grew faster, more frantic. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam cutting in and out. I stumbled into a large, open room, my eyes widening at what I saw. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, each one different in shape and size. Some were ancient, their faces worn and cracked, while others looked pristine, untouched by time. But they all had one thing in common. Their hands were frozen at 2:17. The ticking sound surrounded me now, deafening, though none of the clocks were moving. My flashlight died completely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, its weak glow the only light left. Then I saw it, something moving between the clocks. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with jerky mechanical precision, its head swiveling toward me. Two glowing orbs where its eyes should have been fixed on me. Unblinking, the figure stepped closer, its movements accompanied by the sound of grinding gears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as it reached out with a hand made of twisted metal. Suddenly, all the clocks in the room began to chime at once, their discordant tones echoing through the factory. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony that made my ears ring. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if listening. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The clocks stopped chiming. The room fell silent once more. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, tripping over debris, my phone's light bouncing wildly. When I finally burst out of the factory and into the cold night air, I collapsed, gasping for breath. The next day, I returned with my friends, determined to prove what I'd seen. But when we entered the factory, the clocks were gone. The walls were bare, and the room was empty. Only one thing remained: my flashlight lying on the floor where I'd dropped it, the beam still pointed at the wall, and etched into the scorched brick were the words, "Time belongs to us." It had been abandoned for decades, they said. The old carnival on the edge of town was where whispers of disappearances and ghost stories began. My cousin Lily, my brother Matt, and I weren't superstitious, but we were thrill seekers. When we heard about the rumors of the silent Ferris wheel, we knew we had to see it. The carnival grounds were overgrown with weeds, the remnants of rides leaning like skeletons under the pale moonlight. The air smelled of rust and mildew, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the faint creak of old machinery swaying in the wind. "It's just an old theme park," Matt said, kicking a piece of debris. "Nothing scary here," but Lily shushed him. "Do you hear that?" We all stopped. Faint, distant music, circus-like but slow and distorted, drifted through the air. It came from deeper within the grounds where the Ferris wheel loomed like a hulking shadow. "Probably just the wind messing with something," I said, though I didn't believe it. We followed the sound, stepping carefully over fallen beams and debris. The carnival had been frozen in time, like everyone had abandoned it in a rush. Food carts still had faded, rusting signs. A clown cutout with peeling paint grinned at us from a booth, its painted eyes unsettlingly sharp. When we reached the Ferris wheel, it stood tall and ominous, half covered in vines. The metal creaked softly, but there was no wind. And yet one of the cabins swayed gently at the top, as though someone had just climbed aboard. "Look," Lily whispered, pointing to a nearby ticket booth. The window was shattered, and a single ticket sat on the counter, fresh and clean. "Who would leave that here?" Matt asked, his voice low. "It's probably staged. Some prank to scare people," I said, but my voice faltered. Then the music swelled. The Ferris wheel lit up, dim bulbs flickering one by one in unnatural patterns. It began to move slowly, groaning as the rusted gears turned. There was no electricity here, no power source. "We need to leave," Lily said, stepping back, but Matt moved forward, drawn to the glowing ride. "What if someone's controlling it?" "Matt, don't!" I shouted. Before we could stop him, he reached the base of the wheel. He craned his neck to look at the swaying cabin, but his face twisted into horror. "There's someone in there," he said, stumbling back toward us. I grabbed his arm. "What did you see?" "It wasn't human," he whispered. As if in response, the wheel stopped abruptly, the cabin at the top jerking into place. The music cut out, leaving a ringing silence. Then came a voice, distorted and metallic, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. "Your turn," it said. We froze, unsure if we had heard it or imagined it. Then the cabin door at the bottom swung open with a screech, inviting us in. "No way," I said, pulling Matt and Lily away. But the moment we turned to leave, the lights around the carnival blazed to life. Every ride groaned to motion. The carousel spun, its horses moving with unnatural speed. A funhouse door opened with a low moan, shadows flickering inside. The Ferris wheel cabin groaned louder, its open door beckoning us. We tried to run, but the ground shifted under our feet, pulling us closer to the ride. The air grew thick and cold, our breath visible in the moonlight. "What do we do?" Lily screamed. "Don't get on," I shouted, gripping her hand. But then the shadows emerged. Dark figures crawling from the funhouse, the carousel, the food carts. Their movements were jerky, wrong, like puppets held up by invisible strings. They surrounded us, cutting off every escape. The voice returned, louder now. "Your turn." I don't know why I did it, but I stepped forward. "Fine," I said, trembling. "We'll ride. Just let us go afterward." The shadows paused, then melted back into the darkness. The Ferris wheel door swung wider, and the three of us climbed into the cabin, shaking. The ride started, pulling us higher into the air. As we reached the top, the carnival below shifted. The rides disappeared, replaced by black nothingness. The shadowy figures writhed below, their faces melting into screams. The voice returned. "You looked. You stay." But just as I felt the cabin lurch forward, the wheel stopped. The lights blinked out, and the shadows froze. We were sitting in an empty field, the Ferris wheel gone. The carnival was no more, as if it had never been. We ran and never looked back. Weeks later, I developed a rash on my arm. It formed the shape of a Ferris wheel. It was an old farmhouse, sitting far from any modern conveniences. My family had moved in after the previous owner passed away, and the house had been untouched for years. The place had its charm: antique furniture, wooden floors, and that strange, musty smell. But something about the basement unsettled me from the start. The door to the cellar was small, barely noticeable at the base of the staircase. It was hidden under a thin rug and secured with a rusted metal latch. My father would sometimes go down there to retrieve canned goods or check the water pump, but he always insisted it wasn't worth exploring further. "Nothing down there, but old junk," he'd say with a dismissive wave. But curiosity got the better of me. One rainy evening, when the house creaked with every gust of wind, I decided to investigate. The cellar was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved vegetables and dusty tools from decades ago. In the corner stood a wooden chair, nothing special really, except it seemed out of place. The air was damp, heavy, and the silence was almost suffocating. Every time the wind blew, it whistled through unseen cracks, creating a haunting, rhythmic sound. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the far end of the cellar, beyond the shelves, there was another door. One I had never seen before. It was painted black, its edges worn as if dragged through the earth itself. It had no handle, no visible lock, only a faint impression as though it had been designed to blend in with the stone wall. I walked toward it slowly, my breath fogging in the cold air. Something felt wrong. The closer I got, the harder it became to move. My limbs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. Suddenly, the bulb above flickered out entirely, plunging the cellar into darkness. A low whispering began. Voices, distant and indistinct, brushing against my ears. They spoke words I couldn't quite hear, and yet I knew they weren't benign. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely audible. The whispering stopped. I reached out toward the black door, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. There was a texture, as though the door wasn't wood at all, but something far more ancient and unnatural. I pushed against it, though it didn't budge. It felt as if it wasn't meant to be opened, meant to remain hidden forever. I backed away slowly, the whispering beginning again, but louder this time. The voices weren't just speaking anymore. They were chanting, low and rhythmic, as if a chant rising from deep within the earth itself. The temperature dropped rapidly, and an oppressive weight settled on my chest. The air grew thick with something otherworldly. Panic gripped me. I reached blindly for my flashlight, turning it, on just in time to see the black door shift. It didn't move outward. It shifted inward, melting into the wall as if swallowing itself. And then, it wasn't a door anymore. It was a void that stretched endlessly into darkness, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The whispering grew louder, morphing into a chorus of voices, some crying, some laughing, each sound hauntingly, familiar, yet alien. My breath hitched, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, a low, guttural whisper right in my ear. "You should have left it alone," I screamed as the void surged toward me, pulling me into the darkness. The library was massive, stretching across several floors with endless rows of shelves, books stacked from floor to ceiling. It was old, filled with the scent of aged paper and dust. I worked the late shift, alone, as usual. Every creak in the floorboards seemed magnified in the stillness. The chandeliers above cast long shadows that danced against the walls, but even with the occasional flicker of light, the deeper corners of the library seemed darker, more oppressive. At first, it wasn't anything unusual, just another quiet night with the occasional rustling sound, likely caused by the settling of the old building. But as the hours dragged on, I began to notice things. Subtle, unsettling details that made my skin crawl. I had been shelving a stack of books when I heard a faint whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. I paused, glancing around, but the aisles were empty. The library was eerily quiet once again. Brushing it off, I continued my work. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing between two shelves. A shadowy figure, unmoving, watching. No details, just a hollow outline of a person, tall and gaunt. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Heart racing, I took a step back, but my foot brushed against something cold. Looking down, I saw a book lying face down on the floor, its pages torn, as though something had been ripped from it. "What the hell?" I muttered. I hurried toward the front desk, heart pounding against my ribs. My fingers fumbled over the phone as I tried to call security. The line went dead. Static hissed through the receiver. The whispers started again, low, almost inaudible at first, but they grew louder with each passing second, creeping into my ears like nails scratching against glass. I turned around slowly. The shadow was closer now, looming between the shelves. The eyes, empty sockets, stared into mine, empty, lifeless. Its figure seemed to shimmer slightly as though bending the light around it. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The aisles were endless, packed with books and shadows. The whispers reached a fever pitch, rising to a deafening cacophony as the figure moved closer. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the library. A voice that was not mine. A voice that shouldn't have been there, whispering my name. "Who are you?" I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek. Ice cold. My knees buckled and I fell to the ground, my scream echoing through the silent library. The figure towered above me now, its distorted shape twitching unnaturally. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a heavy encyclopedia from a nearby shelf and smashed it against the figure. The hollow shape flickered violently before collapsing into a cloud of black mist. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced by deafening silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When I finally found the courage to stand, the figure was gone. The book on the floor was gone too, along with the ripped pages. The library was empty once more, but I knew I wouldn't forget that night. We had been hiking all day, winding through narrow trails and dense forests. The mountains rose around us, jagged and imposing, and the cool evening air carried the scent of pine and earth. It was beautiful, remote, and serene. After hours of trekking, we finally found a clearing. My friends and I pitched our tents, set up camp, and gathered around a crackling fire. The stars were beginning to peek out from the dark sky, and for a moment, Everything felt peaceful. "Perfect," Ethan said, stretching out on a nearby rock. "Just us and nature." We had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. No phones, no noise, no interruptions, just the wilderness. But as the night deepened, that peace began to feel uneasy. The fire hissed and popped, shadows flickering wildly against the trees. We heard nothing beyond the crackling of the flames. No birds, no animals, not even the distant hum of civilization. Just silence. "Hey," Emily whispered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Where did the others go?" Ethan and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" "Our friends," she said. "They were here a minute ago. They were sitting by the tents and now, nothing. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. Our friends were gone. Just the three of us remained." "They probably walked off somewhere," Ethan suggested, though his voice wavered. But as the minutes passed, no sign of them returned. No sounds of movement, no distant laughter, nothing, just the stillness of the forest. It was as if they had vanished completely. "We should look for them," Emily said, standing. Her flashlight flicked on, casting long beams into the dark. "Woods. We're not splitting up," I warned her. "Let's stay by the fire." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's not safe. Whatever happened, they'll come back." But as we sat there, the unease deepened. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, shapes that seemed too unnatural to be mere tricks of the firelight. We heard faint whispers, almost like voices carried on the breeze, but when we tried to pinpoint them, they disappeared. "I don't like this," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I can feel them. Watching." The fire flickered again, and this time I swear I saw something shift behind the flames. A shadow, tall and humanoid, standing just beyond the perimeter of the light. It was fleeting, impossible to focus on, but unmistakable. "What is that?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, gripping my flashlight tighter. "Stay close." Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just in our ears, it was inside our heads. Words we couldn't quite make out, but they sent a chill down our spines. The shadows began to close in, slithering closer to the fire. The forest, once a comforting expanse, now felt like a living entity, breathing, alive, watching. Then the faint sounds of movement, something heavy, deliberate, creeping through the underbrush. A low, guttural growl followed, distant but chillingly close. My heart pounded in my chest. "They're coming," Emily said, her breath ragged. "We have to go." Ethan grabbed her hand, and we bolted for the tents, stumbling through the uneven ground. Behind us, the whispers and growls grew louder, more aggressive. The shadows followed, their forms now far more distinct. A twisted, humanoid shape with sharp, jagged claws. The fire flared once more and revealed them. Their faces were twisted beyond recognition, with hollow eyes and grotesque smiles. They moved unnaturally fast, jerking between trees, impossibly silent. And they weren't alone. More shadows emerged, crowding the edge of the firelight, a sea of black, monstrous shapes. I reached our tent first, fumbling with the zipper. Ethan and Emily weren't far behind. The tent finally zipped closed and we huddled inside, holding our breath as the sound of movement surrounded us. But they didn't stop. The growls and whispers continued, so close it felt like they were inside the tent with us. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time was warped. But then, just as quickly as they came, the sounds faded. The shadows receded, and silence returned. We emerged from the tent slowly, hearts still racing. The campsite was still and dark. The fire burned down to embers. Our friends were gone, completely vanished. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. "They're still here," Ethan whispered. They never left. And deep in the distance, a faint, chilling laughter echoed through the forest. It began as a harmless dare. My friends and I were walking home late one night when we passed the old train station on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for decades, its tracks overgrown with weeds, its windows boarded up. The place was a relic, forgotten and avoided. "You know the story," Jake said, grinning. "They say if you stand on the platform at midnight, the train will come. But it's not for the living." Emma rolled her eyes. "Please, that's just a stupid urban legend." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Prove it. Midnight's in 20 minutes. I hesitated, staring at the crumbling station. The air around it felt wrong, heavy. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about the challenge made my skin crawl. "Let's do it," I said finally. We climbed over the rusted gate and made our way to the platform. The station was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Moonlight cast long shadows, and the air felt colder here, as if the place itself rejected warmth. We stood on the cracked concrete, shivering. The tracks stretched endlessly into the darkness, disappearing into the night. "See?" Emma said. "Nothing to worry about." Jake checked his watch. "Just wait, 2 minutes to midnight." The minutes dragged. The longer we stood there, the heavier the air became, like we were sinking into some unseen void. Then, at exactly midnight, it happened. The faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the air. We froze. Emma laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." But then we felt it. A low vibration beneath our feet, like the ground was alive. A light appeared in the distance, growing brighter, cutting through the darkness like a knife. "That's impossible," I whispered. The light came closer, and the sound of grinding metal filled the air. A train emerged from the shadows, its cars black and glinting like polished obsidian. It wasn't like any train I'd ever seen. Its windows were dark, its wheels emitting a strange rhythmic hum. It glided to a stop in front of us, silent now except for the hiss of steam. The doors slid open. Inside, the train was dimly lit, its seats lined with figures. At first, I thought they were mannequins. Still silent, their faces blank. But then, one turned its head. Its eyes were hollow sockets, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Slowly, the others began to move, their heads tilting toward us, their eyeless gazes locked on our group. "We should leave," Emma whispered, backing away. But Jake stepped closer. "No way. This has to be a trick. Some prank." "Jake, don't," I said, grabbing his arm. Too late. A figure emerged from the train, a tall man in a conductor's uniform, his face shadowed by a cap. He held out a hand, his voice low and chilling. "Tickets, please." "We don't have tickets," Emma stammered, her voice barely audible. The conductor tilted his head. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 slips of paper. He extended them toward us. "For you." I don't know why, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the ticket. The paper was cold, almost wet, and as I stared at it, words began to form. My name appeared, scrawled in ink that seemed to seep into the page. "Get on," the conductor said, his voice now echoing. Unnaturally, I shook my head, dropping the ticket. "No, we're leaving." The conductor stepped closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the platform. The figures inside the train began to rise from their seats, their movements jerky, unnatural. Emma grabbed my arm. "Run!" We turned, and bolted, Jake close behind us. The train let out a deafening whistle, and I felt the ground tremble as if the station itself was about to collapse. Behind us, the conductor's voice rang out, deep and guttural. "You can't outrun it. Your ticket is already punched." We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road. The station was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at my hand, I saw the faint outline of the ticket's ink. still etched into my skin. None of us speak about that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the faint whistle of a train in the distance, even when there are no tracks nearby, and I know it's coming for me. It was late when we arrived at the abandoned train station. My friends and I had heard stories, whispered tales about how the station wasn't as empty as it seemed. The building had been closed for years, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken windows. The local authorities had shut it down after reports of strange happenings, faint voices, flickering lights, and figures that appeared in photographs but couldn't be seen in person. Ryan, Mark, and I decided to explore anyway. We didn't believe in ghosts or curses. We brought flashlights, cameras, and our usual bravado, thinking it would be another uneventful adventure. The inside of the station was eerily quiet. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of old wires echoed softly in the empty corridors. We wandered through, taking photos of the decaying platform, the graffiti-covered walls, and the forgotten ticket counters. Nothing seemed unusual, at first, just a place frozen in time. As we continued deeper into the station, we noticed strange things. Mark's camera kept glitching, displaying flickering figures, hazy shadows that drifted through the pictures. At first, we dismissed it as a malfunction, but when Ryan's flashlight suddenly dimmed and then died entirely, we began to feel uneasy. "Okay," I said, forcing a laugh. "Let's call it a night. Nothing here is weird. Yet." But as we made our way back toward the entrance, things started to change. The station seemed quieter, if that was possible. The usual creaks of old wood and metal had stopped. The air grew colder, heavier. We walked past one of the boarded windows, but my flashlight suddenly flickered again. This time, I saw it. A figure, distorted, standing in the distance, just outside the glass. It wasn't moving, just staring. I could barely make out its face. Lips pulled into a grotesque, silent smile. Eyes hollow. "Guys, stop," I whispered, shining my light on the window. But the figure had already disappeared. "Nothing's there," Mark said, though his voice held a trace of doubt. "It's just the darkness playing tricks." We continued on, our unease growing. Then Ryan froze mid-step. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the station's ancient air conditioning. Mark shook his head. "Nothing but your imagination." Yet, as we turned down a long corridor, there was no mistaking it. A faint whisper, low and desperate, filled the air. It wasn't coming from anywhere we could see. It surrounded us, echoing in every direction. "We need to leave," Ryan said, urgently. Now! The station had become a maze, twisting and turning with no clear way back. Our flashlights flickered again, one by one, until the darkness consumed us. We were left in total blackness. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it again. A voice, almost indistinguishable. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was laughter. It was closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing my friends by the arms. But our feet felt heavier, our breathing labored. The laughter echoed through the walls, louder now, malicious and hollow. As we stumbled into what we thought was an exit, we emerged into a different room, one with photos lining the walls. They were the same photographs we had taken earlier, but these were different. Faces, hundreds of them. People we had never seen before, staring back at us with hollow, lifeless eyes. Some were smiling grotesquely, their mouths open in silent screams. "Get out of here!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking as we tried to back away. But something grabbed my arm, cold, clammy fingers that burned into my skin. I looked down and saw it. A reflection in the shattered glass of one of the photographs. A figure stood behind me, its face just behind mine, closer than it should have been. "No," I gasped. The figure tilted its head, its lips curving into that horrifying smile. It wasn't breathing, it wasn't human. Yet its gaze bore into mine with an unsettling hunger. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then the lights flickered one last time, and the figure vanished. The photographs crumbled into ash, and the darkness around us lifted just enough for us to see the entrance again. We ran. Outside the station, we collapsed in the dirt, gasping for breath. The building stood still behind us, silent once more. But the air was different now. The weight of the station lingered in our chests. We had survived, but something had followed us, and we knew, deep down, that it wasn't truly gone. It started when my grandmother passed away. We inherited her house, a small, charming place tucked away on the edge of a forgotten town, remote, isolated, and untouched by modern life. It was the perfect spot for a quiet retreat, far from the chaos of the city. The house itself was old, built in the late 1800s, surrounded by overgrown gardens and trees that seemed to tower above the house. Everything about it felt frozen in time, almost as though it had been untouched for decades. When we arrived, there was an unsettling silence. The town itself seemed abandoned. No signs of life, no movement, as if the world had simply forgotten it. The streets were lined with empty shops, broken windows, and faded, peeling signs. The only sound was the wind whispering through the broken streets. The house was no different. From the moment we stepped inside, we could feel it. A heavy, oppressive feeling, like something had taken root here and refused to let go. The air was thick, stagnant, and there was an eerie sense of being watched. The furniture was covered. In white sheets, the rooms filled with the smell of dust and decay. We tried to shake off the feeling, telling ourselves it was just the weight of the past. But the feeling only grew stronger as the days passed. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of our vision. Doors creaked open on their own, and the air felt colder in certain rooms, even with the windows shut. One night, as I lay awake, unable to sleep, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, not coming from any direction but from inside the house itself. It wasn't something I could pinpoint, just a faint, low murmur, like someone standing just behind me, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time, almost as though it was speaking my name. I sat up, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The whisper faded away as quickly as it had come. The next morning, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the old house settling, or perhaps the remnants of my dreams. But as the days went on, the whispers became more persistent. They didn't always come in words, but in sounds, muttering, almost like a distant conversation I couldn't quite grasp. And there were other things, shadows that seemed to watch me from the corners of rooms, figures that would appear in the corner of my vision and vanish the moment I turned to face them. One evening, I was sitting by the window, staring out at the empty town. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the streets. I saw a figure standing there, motionless. Its silhouette was distorted, almost unnatural, like a hollow mask where a face should be. It wasn't watching me. It was watching the house. Panic gripped me, but I couldn't look away. It didn't move, didn't shift. It was as though it was waiting for something. Or someone. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting us. I couldn't take the whispers anymore, the feeling of being watched. Grabbing a flashlight, I explored the house from top to bottom, my pulse quickening with each creak of the wooden floorboards. Nothing prepared me for what I found in the basement. The air down there was colder than anywhere else in the house. The flickering flashlight revealed old shelves, long empty bottles of something that had long since evaporated. But then I saw it, something that stopped me in my tracks. A figure stood at the far end of the basement. It was different from the others. Taller, darker, more solid, but still hollow, as if only half of it existed. Its head tilted as I approached, but it made no sound, no movement, just stood there, waiting, "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. It didn't answer, but the whispers grew louder in my head. Words this time, impossible to ignore. "Get out," they said, over and over. "Leave this place." Terror surged through me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the old cobblestones. My breath came, in shallow gasps, and I didn't look back. When I made it back upstairs, the house felt different. The oppressive weight was gone, but so was that sense of safety. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't truly gone. They were buried, waiting for the next time they'd rise. We haven't stayed long since that night. The house is still there, just as it was, untouched. And though we've moved on, I still wonder if it waits, patient and silent, as if waiting for us to return and finish what we started. The whispers, the shadows, they're still there, always, watching, always lurking, and sometimes I swear I hear them again, even now, in the quiet of the night. The moment I stepped into the auction house, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the building itself. It was old, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was the air, thick and stale, as if it hadn't been aired in years. The low murmur of. The crowd had an eerie quality to it, like everyone was speaking in whispers, yet no one was saying a word. My friends and I had heard about this exclusive auction. The items were said to be from places no one had ever dared explore. Intrigued, we decided to check it out. The room was dim, only a few flickering lights above casting shadows across the tall, marble columns. An old man with a sharp suit stood behind the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. He smiled when he saw us, his lips twisting in a way that didn't seem quite human. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep, like the creaking of old wood. "Tonight, you will have the opportunity to acquire pieces, unlike any you've ever seen." He wasn't wrong. The first item up for auction was an old wooden chest. It looked harmless enough, ancient and worn, the kind of thing you might find in an attic. But when the lid was opened, the smell hit me. It wasn't a smell of old wood or dust. It was a stench of rot, the kind that makes your stomach churn. The chest was empty, except for a small, handwritten note resting at the bottom. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel its presence, like it was whispering something in my mind. The crowd was oddly still as the auctioneer began his bidding. I turned to my friends, and I could see they were unsettled too. Jake, always the skeptic, leaned in close. "Something's off about this place," he whispered. "Let's get out of here." But something held me in place, an invisible pull that I couldn't ignore. And when the auctioneer called for the next item, I found myself walking toward the front without meaning to. The next piece was even more bizarre. A cracked mirror, its surface distorted in a way that made the reflection look wrong. It warped the image of anyone who looked at it, elongating features, twisting faces into grotesque shapes. The crowd's excitement grew as the bidding began. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The mirror seemed to reach out to me, pulling my gaze, making my heart race. I felt trapped in the reflection, as though I was being sucked in, piece by piece. I forced myself to turn away, and that's when I saw it. The painting. It was hung in the corner of the room, surrounded by shadows. A figure stood there, cloaked in darkness with no clear features, just an absence where its face should have been. But its eyes were unmistakable. I don't know how, but I knew. They were staring directly at me. The auctioneer was still speaking, but his voice had become muffled. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the painting. It felt like the room was closing in around me, the air thick with something unnatural. I could hear the whispers now, but they weren't coming from the crowd. They were coming from the painting, from the empty eyes that followed my every movement. I turned, my pulse pounding in my ears, and ran for the door. But it wouldn't open. Panic rose in my chest. I could hear my friends calling out to me. But the words were drowned out by the increasing whispers growing louder and louder. "You cannot leave." It wasn't in my head. The words were spoken aloud by the painting. Its voice was hollow, distant, as if it came from the deepest recesses of the earth. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, and then the whispers stopped. The lights flickered. I turned around. The auctioneer was gone. The crowd was gone. The only thing left in the room was the painting, and it was moving. The figure stepped out of the frame, its form no longer a blur of shadow but a solid, dark figure standing in front of me. It was taller than any man I had ever seen, its limbs too long, its body too thin. The face remained empty, a void, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze cutting through me like ice. My friends were gone. The doors were still locked. The room felt endless, the walls bending inward. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, and I felt its coldness like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, with a sudden lurch, I was back in the real world. The auction house was gone. The room was normal again, bright lights, crowded with people. But I wasn't alone. I turned to find my friends standing beside me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't seen anything, but they could feel it too, the strange, unnatural presence that still clung to us. We left the building as quickly as we could, never looking back. But the whispers followed us, and I realized then that the auction had never ended. It had only just begun. It was supposed to be a simple job. I'd been hired to take care of a woman's elderly uncle, Mr. Mallory, for the weekend. The family had gone out of town and they wanted someone to check on him, keep him company, and make sure he took his medication. He lived alone in a sprawling old mansion that had been in his family for generations, perched on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. The place was remote, isolated, the kind of house you'd expect to see in horror movies. I didn't mind. I needed the money. Mr. Mallory was pleasant enough, slow-moving, frail, but with a sharp mind. He lived in the parlor most of the time, sitting by the window and staring out at the sea. He'd occasionally speak to me, but most of the time, he preferred the silence. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to his age. The first evening, after dinner, he asked me to close the heavy curtains in the parlor. It was getting dark, and he didn't like the view of the ocean at night. "Too many things out there," he muttered cryptically, his hand shaking as he handed me the curtain rope. I thought little of it. It was just a man's preference. I finished, closing the curtains, and the room seemed to shrink in the dim light, making it feel even more isolated. Mr. Mallory had retreated to his chair, staring vacantly at the floor. "Don't mind the house, dear," he said without looking up. "It has its secrets, and some of them are still here." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Old people often said strange things. The night passed uneventfully, though I found it difficult to sleep in the house. The wind howled outside, and the sound of creaking floorboards in the halls kept me on edge. At around 2 a.m., I was awoken by a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from downstairs. I held my breath. It came again, louder this time. A faint dragging, like something heavy moving across the floor. I hesitated, but decided to investigate. I tiptoed down the dark staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the noise stopped. My flashlight flickered as I shone it into the hallway. Nothing. Just empty rooms, their doors ajar. I took a few cautious steps forward. Then I saw it. A shadow, barely visible, moving from one room to the next at the far end of the hallway. I froze. The shadow didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. I called out, "Hello, Mr. Mallory?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to hear me. Slowly, I crept closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Mr. Mallory stood there, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Don't follow it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's been watching me for years." Before I could ask what he meant, the shadow moved again, disappearing into one of the rooms. I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned to Mr. Mallory. "Who is it? What is that thing?" His voice cracked. "You don't want to know. Stay upstairs. Stay out of its reach. It's waiting." I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed back up to the parlor, locking the door behind me. My pulse was racing, and my hands were clammy. What was that thing? Why didn't Mr. Mallory seem shocked? The night dragged on in silence. The next morning, Mr. Mallory seemed calm, almost normal. He was sitting in his chair again, staring out the window at the churning sea. I wanted to ask him more about last night, but he simply looked at me and said, "You don't want to know." When the family returned later that afternoon, everything seemed fine, too fine. The house was silent, the air still. They were surprised to find Mr. Mallory in good spirits, talking about the weather. Nothing unusual. I mentioned the strange occurrences, but they dismissed it with a laugh. "He's getting on in years," they said. "Sometimes his mind plays tricks on him." But I wasn't convinced. As I left the house that evening, I glanced back at the dark windows of the mansion. And there, at the top floor, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing perfectly still, staring down at me. Its face was pale, twisted, empty, just like Mr. Mallory had described. I couldn't explain what it was, but as I drove away, I realized the terrifying truth. The figure in the window hadn't been watching Mr. Mallory all these years. It had been watching me. It was supposed to be a routine trip, just a weekend getaway for some fresh air and a break from the chaos of everyday life. My friends and I decided to visit an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Rumors had swirled around the place for years, but no one could verify if they were true or not. Abandoned factories are always eerie, but this one had a reputation that made people shiver. We wanted to see if the stories were more than just hearsay. The factory loomed over us like a rusted giant, towering and silent. Its crumbling facade was marked with faded graffiti and the shattered remains of windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the kind that settles into the cracks of old metal and concrete. We explored cautiously, stepping over piles of debris and broken machinery. The echoes of our footsteps seemed to stretch endlessly through the empty spaces. First, there was nothing unusual, just the creaking of metal, the groans of the building settling on its foundation. But as we moved deeper into the facility, that eerie silence started to feel oppressive. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. No wind, no distant sounds from the city beyond the factory walls. Around midday, we stumbled upon a room filled with old radio equipment. The walls were covered in wires, faded dials, and cobwebbed microphones. It was like something out of a bygone era, untouched since the factory's last days of operation. Something about it felt strange. Like this room had been waiting for us. Ryan, always the curious one, decided to tinker with the equipment. After fiddling with the old radio, a faint static hiss began to crackle from the speakers. At first, we ignored it, thinking it was just interference. But then, the static gave way to a voice, thin and trembling, as if it had been trapped there for decades. "Is anyone out there?" the voice asked. We froze. None of us had touched the radio itself, yet it seemed to be broadcasting. "Who's there?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. There was no reply, only more static. But then, after a long silence, the voice returned, this time clearer, more insistent. "I've been waiting. Please, someone. Help." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. No one spoke. We all exchanged wide-eyed glances. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. "Where are you?" Emma whispered. The response came as a whisper, almost lost in the static. "The factory. The broadcast is the only way. Please, help me." Ryan, still shaken, tried to speak again, but the radio cut him off. "Turn back. Don't stay here," the voice begged, its tone now desperate. "Please, leave, before it's too late." None of us knew what to make of it. Was it a prank? Some malfunction? But something about that voice didn't feel like a joke. The desperation in it was real. Far too real. "We should leave," I suggested, my voice trembling. But Emma hesitated, staring at the radio as if something was about to happen. "I think," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's trying to tell us something." That's when the static returned, louder this time, distorted. The voice was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling hum that vibrated through the speakers. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on us. Something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow, shifting and slithering like smoke. We all turned to face it, but there was nothing there. Yet we knew something was watching. Us, something far beyond our comprehension. Fearing whatever presence had been trapped with that voice, we decided to leave. The radio was still broadcasting static as we fled the factory, but we didn't dare look back. Once we were outside, the oppressive silence of the factory gave way to the distant sounds of the city. None of us spoke much on the way home. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The voice, though distant, still echoed in my mind. Days passed, but the memory of that broadcast haunted us. We tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank or a malfunction. But then, several weeks later, I received a message from an unknown number. It simply read, "Help us. The broadcast never stops. I haven't answered. I don't know if I ever will." We had never expected to find ourselves wandering through the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city. The place had been sealed off for decades, a relic of some bygone era. Our group of friends, 3 of us, decided to explore the underground labyrinth as a kind of reckless adventure, seeking something far from the ordinary. The air down there was thick, musty, and oppressive. Cracked tiles stretched endlessly down the tunnel, illuminated only by our dim flashlight beams. Water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic patterns, forming small puddles that shimmered under the faint light. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft echoes of our footsteps. At first, it felt like any other exploration. Creepy, sure, but nothing we couldn't handle. We were careful not to stray too far from the surface access point, as rumors of dangerous creatures lurking down here had always kept the tunnels off limits. But something about this place felt wrong. As we ventured deeper, the sense of isolation grew more oppressive. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading us farther from the surface. Shadows lurked in the corners of the flashlight beams, shifting unnaturally whenever we turned to look. The silence became more than just quiet. It felt like something was watching, waiting. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old subway station, long since abandoned. The walls were covered in faded, peeling advertisements, and a train sat eerily, still on the tracks, its rusted metal reflecting our lights in dull, distorted shapes. The station was dead, except for the lingering echoes of our footsteps. That's when we heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. A faint, hollow whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. It was like the sound of the wind, but it carried a strange, otherworldly quality. It whispered again, clearer this time, as if the voice was directly in our heads. "Leave," it said, its tone calm yet unsettling. We exchanged nervous glances but shrugged it off. We decided to push forward, convinced it was just our imagination. The feeling of being watched only intensified. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, appearing and disappearing in ways that couldn't be explained. The further we went, the more we felt like we were no longer alone. By the time we reached the next station, something changed. The air grew colder. The whispers returned, louder now. "Leave," they seemed to echo all around us, distorted, overlapping. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was as if the tunnels themselves were speaking, a chorus of voices stretching from the shadows. We tried to press on, desperate to find our way back to the surface. But the tunnels twisted endlessly, leading us deeper and deeper. No matter how far we walked, the whispers followed us, growing more insistent. They weren't just words anymore. They were commands, demands. "Leave, leave, leave." At some point, we lost track of where we were. The flashlight beams barely cut through the blackness, and the shadows seemed alive, creeping closer every second. My friends were frantic now, panic taking hold. I could see it in their eyes. Fear had taken root. Then, from the darkness, we heard it. A sound that stopped us dead in our tracks. A low, raspy breath. Closer this time, right behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. And the whispers, louder now, filling our heads. "Leave, leave, leave." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My friends stood frozen beside me, their faces pale and wide with terror. Whatever was down there wasn't just some wandering spirit. It was something far worse. Something that had been waiting for us, buried deep beneath the city. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening again, oppressive and suffocating. The darkness around us seemed thicker now, almost like it was alive, pressing down. "Run!" a voice suddenly roared in my head. We didn't hesitate. We bolted down the tunnels, sprinting back toward the surface, heartbeats pounding in our ears. The whispers started again, echoing behind us. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. When we finally emerged, gasping for air, we didn't look back. The city stretched out before us, and we didn't stop running until we were safe in the daylight. That day, we escaped. But whatever was down there, the thing that watched, that whispered, that chased us, we'll never forget. And neither will the darkness. It started with a simple trip to a remote industrial zone, long abandoned and forgotten. My friends and I had heard rumors of a place no one dared enter, an old factory complex deep in the heart of an isolated stretch of land, untouched by time. The internet was full of stories, some claiming strange occurrences, whispers of ghosts that haunted the empty buildings. We wanted to explore it, curiosity outweighing caution. We arrived under the cover of night, the crumbling factory buildings, looming in the dim glow of our flashlights. The air was thick, laden with dust and the faint scent of decay. The towering chimneys rose like jagged fingers against the dark sky. We moved cautiously, each step crunching on broken concrete and debris. Inside the main building, we found a room filled with faded machinery, rusted pipes, and the faint echo of our footsteps. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. There were no windows, only the faint glow of our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The ceiling creaked above us, as though the building itself was unsettled by our presence. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, like the wind brushing through the empty halls. But they didn't sound natural. They came from within the walls, distorted, unintelligible. It wasn't the wind after all. They seemed to be carried through the very foundation of the building. We stopped moving, our eyes darting to each other, unsure if we'd heard right. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," Ryan said, his flashlight trembling. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. A low, guttural murmur, as if they were coming from deep below, surfacing from the shadows of the earth itself. The air grew colder, and we felt as though we were being watched. Something was down there, beneath us. We couldn't see it, but we knew it wasn't human. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound echoed from the direction of a nearby hallway. We froze. The whispers intensified, mingling with the noise, growing louder, more insistent. A faint, flickering light appeared at the end of the corridor, casting unnatural shadows that danced across the broken walls. "Go," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't argue. We moved quickly, our footsteps hurried as we retraced our path. The whispers followed us, now echoing through the halls in unison, becoming a cacophony of distorted sounds. It was as if whatever had been lurking in the darkness was closing in. As we reached the entrance, something unexpected happened. The whispers abruptly ceased, replaced by a sudden, oppressive silence. We hesitated at the threshold, our hearts pounding. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was there, waiting. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Not just our flashlights, but the entire complex, as if the building itself was coming to life. The shadows became more distinct, growing longer, stretching toward us as, though drawn by some unseen force, a final, chilling whisper echoed in my ear, clear as day this time. "Leave." We didn't wait. We ran, out into the night, away from that cursed place. The factory loomed behind us, dark and silent once again. When we looked back, there was nothing. No signs of life, no evidence that we had ever been there. Now, months later, I can still hear those whispers at night. No one believes me when I tell them, but I know what I heard. I know we were not alone, and whatever was down there, whatever remains, watches, waiting, always. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. "Just the house settling," Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. "Could be an animal," Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. "Go away." I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. "It's nothing," Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. "Just the ocean." But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. "Leave." I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. "It's here," I gasped. "It's still here." Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. "Leave now," panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum. Low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared at me, her voice trembling. "It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable, like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. "Get out." The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close, too close. "Run," the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered. Fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out.